Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Go ahead and pull that blanket just a little higher. Find the cool side of your pillow, the one that always feels like a small mercy at the end of a long day. If you have a glass of water nearby, take a slow sip. Let your shoulders drop. Let your jaw unclench. You are exactly where you are supposed to be right now, and there is nowhere else you need to go tonight. This story is going to come to you slowly. That is a promise. There is no rush here, no sudden loud moment, no reason to tense your body or hold your breath. We are going to walk through this together, one quiet step at a time, as if we are moving through a house where all the clocks have stopped. You are safe. The door is locked. The night is soft around you. And by the time this story finds its end, your eyes may already be closed. Tonight, we are going back to the cold, humming, restless city of Chicago. Back to an era when the streets were still cobblestone in places, when horses pulled milk wagons before sunrise, when the smell of coal fires drifted from chimneys and settled low in the winter air like a gray shawl over the rooftops. It is the year 1904. The century is still young and full of strange promises. The world is changing faster than most people can understand, and in that change, in that beautiful and disorienting forward motion, there are spaces where things can go terribly wrong. There is a man walking through those spaces. He knows them well. He has been walking through them for years. His name, at least for now, is Johann Hawk. Though by the time you finish this story, you will know that name was only one of many he wore. He was a man made entirely of borrowed identities, the way a magician is made of misdirection. He was ordinary looking. That is the first and most important thing to understand. He did not look like a man who had left a trail of graves behind him. He looked like someone's neighbor, someone's uncle, someone you might nod to on the street without thinking twice. He had a round face and a tidy mustache, the kind men wore in that era to signal respectability. His hands were soft. His voice was warm. He spoke with a gentle German accent that certain women, lonely women, tired women, women who had buried husbands and now sat alone in quiet parlors with nothing but the ticking of a clock for company, found deeply comforting. He knew that. He counted on it. And before we go any further into the darkness of what Johann Hawk did, let us sit for a moment with the women he chose. Because that is where this story truly lives. Not in the courtrooms or the newspaper headlines. Not in the chemistry of poison or the cold arithmetic of money stolen, but in the lives of the women who met him and believed him and trusted him at a moment in their lives when they were most in need of someone trustworthy. They deserve to be seen. They deserve to be understood. Not as victims first, but as human beings first. Women with histories and laughter and favorite recipes and opinions about the weather. Women who had loved and grieved and decided, with real courage, to try again. That courage was the thing he preyed upon. Let us never forget that. Johann Hawk was born in 1860 in the city of Strasbourg, in the German region of Alsace-Lorraine, a place of complicated borders and complicated identity, a land that had been traded back and forth between France and Germany like a card in a game neither side fully won. It was a place where people learned early that the ground beneath you could shift without warning, where you held your sense of self close because the world outside might rearrange itself overnight. Whether this shaped him in some foundational way, nobody can say for certain. What we know is that he was born into a religious household. His father was a minister. Two of his brothers entered the ministry as well. There was a path set before him, a clear and narrow and respectable path, the kind that leads a young man toward Sunday sermons and pastoral visits and a life of modest but genuine service. He walked away from that path, or perhaps more precisely, he never stepped onto it at all. Something in him resisted the constraints of that life. Or perhaps something in him simply recognized, with the cold clarity of a born opportunist, that there was more money to be made from faith than by practicing it. That is speculation, of course. We cannot know what moved behind his eyes in those early years. What we know is that by the time he arrived in America, sometime in the early 1890s, he had already learned the most essential skill of his adult life. He had learned how to become whatever someone needed him to be. America in that era was a country of reinvention. That was part of its mythology, part of its deep and seductive promise. You could come here with nothing and become something. You could shed the old self like a coat that no longer fit and walk forward as a new man in a new land where nobody knew your history. For millions of honest immigrants who carried that dream across the Atlantic, it was a beautiful and hard-won truth. For Johann Haack, it was a practical toolkit. He arrived with nothing but nerve and the particular gift of seeming sincere, and he began immediately to build his inventory of lies. He spoke German fluently, of course, and in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were dense, thriving German immigrant communities in cities all across the American Midwest. In Chicago, in Cincinnati, in Milwaukee and St. Louis, and a dozen other cities where German newspapers were printed and German churches held services and German bakers opened shops that smelled of rye bread and cardamom before the sun was fully up. These communities were tight-knit and proud and full of the particular warmth that displaced people create for one another when they find themselves far from home. They trusted each other in the way that people trust those who share a language and a memory of the same distant streets. That trust was the door he walked through again and again and again. He gave himself different names in different cities. John Schmidt, Henry Bartels, Jacob Huff, Martin Dotz. The names changed like costumes, slipped on and off with practiced ease. And with each new name came a new story. He was a businessman with capital to invest. He was a widower, recently bereaved, lonely in a way that made women want to comfort him. He was a man of means who owned property and had a wealthy father in Germany who would soon be sending more money. He was, in every city, every community, every parlor and candy store and boarding house he entered, exactly what the woman sitting across from him needed him to be. He watched them carefully. He listened. He asked gentle questions and nodded with great seriousness when they answered. He made them feel heard in a way that many of them had not felt heard in years, perhaps ever. And then he began to court them with a speed and an urgency that should have been alarming but somehow never was, because he framed it always as the result of overwhelming emotion, of a heart too full to wait. He was a man swept away by feeling. How could that be anything but flattering? They married him, one after another, in city after city, year after year. By the time the Chicago police finally caught up with him in 1905, investigators believed he had contracted somewhere between 15 and 50 marriages. 15, possibly 50. The range alone is staggering, a testament to how thoroughly he had learned to move between worlds, leaving no clear trail, taking full advantage of a legal system that had no centralized records, no national databases, no way of connecting a man named Henry Bartels in Cincinnati to a man named John Schmidt in Milwaukee to a man named Johann Haack in Chicago, and the women who married him. Some of them lost only their money and their dignity, discovering his deceptions before something worse could happen. Some of them lost everything. Let us take a breath here. A slow one. In through the nose and out through the mouth. Because what comes next, what happened in Chicago in the winter of 1904, is the story that finally unraveled him. And it begins, as so many of his stories began, with a small advertisement in a German-language newspaper. The Chicago Abend Post was a respected institution in the city's German community. It carried news from the old country alongside local stories, announcements, obituaries, and yes, in the back pages, the quiet, desperate columns of personal advertisements. Men seeking women, women seeking companionship, the lonely hearts of a city that could be brutally isolating if you did not have family or community to anchor you. These advertisements were common and generally harmless, a practical response to the reality of urban life in an era before the telephone was ubiquitous and long before anyone could imagine a world where you might meet someone through a glowing rectangle you carried in your pocket. The advertisement that appeared in the Abend Post sometime in late 1904 was brief and somewhat unremarkable on its face. It read, more or less, that a German man of means, a man who owned his own home and had no encumbrances, wished to make the acquaintance of a widow without children, with the goal of matrimony. It was dignified. It was precise. It specified exactly what he was looking for, which is to say it specified exactly the kind of woman he could most easily exploit. A widow, no children, meaning no protective family members likely to ask difficult questions, meaning a woman who had already navigated the grief of losing a husband and had survived it, and was perhaps trying, quietly, and with some vulnerability, to rebuild a life that had been interrupted by death. Several women responded to that advertisement. One of them was Marie Walker, and her story is where the real telling begins. But before we go there, we need to understand the city she lived in, the world she moved through, the specific texture of her daily life, because she was not an abstraction. She was not a cautionary tale waiting to be told. She was a woman with a shop and a schedule and a particular way of folding her apron at the end of a working day, and she deserves more than a paragraph in a history book. Marie Walker lived on Willow Street in Chicago. She ran a candy store, a small establishment that she had built through her own effort and frugality after the end of her previous marriage. She was in her 40s, a compact and capable woman with the particular kind of self-reliance that comes from having learned you can depend on yourself when you must. She had grown up in Germany and come to America as so many had, with hope packed more carefully than anything else in her luggage. She spoke English with an accent. She kept her shop clean. She knew her customers by name. Her sister, Bertha Sohn, lived nearby. This is an important detail, though we will not know why until later. Marie and Bertha were close in the way sisters can be close when they have both come far from home, bound together by shared memory and the particular comfort of someone who knew you before you became whoever you are now. Marie had some small savings. Not a fortune, but the accumulated result of years of careful work. A few $100s. The shop itself. These were the material dimensions of a life she had built on her own terms, and she was not ashamed of any of it. She was a practical woman. She was also, like so many practical women, capable of great tenderness when she allowed herself to feel it. She wrote to the address given in the advertisement. He wrote back, and somewhere in those early letters, in the careful dance of introduction and disclosure that preceded any meeting, she began to feel something she perhaps had not expected to feel again. Something like possibility. Something like the quiet flutter of hope, which is the most vulnerable emotion a person can carry, because hope, unlike most feelings, makes you lean forward into the future, towards something you cannot yet see or touch or know is real. He told her he had $8,000. He told her he owned a cottage at 6225 Union Avenue. He told her his father was wealthy and would soon be sending more funds from Germany. These were the specific shapes of the lies he chose, calibrated precisely to what a woman like Marie would find reassuring. Not extravagance, not grandeur, just enough stability to make the next chapter of life feel possible. Just enough security to make leaning into hope feel safe. They met. He was warm and attentive. He had that quality she had perhaps not encountered in a long time. The quality of making you feel genuinely interesting, genuinely seen. He asked about the shop, about her years in Germany, about what she missed, and what she had found in America that surprised her. He listened to her answers with apparent absorption. He touched her hand when she said something that moved him. He looked at her with eyes that seemed, in those first meetings, to hold real feeling. They became engaged quickly. This was not entirely unusual in that era, when courtship was expected to move toward marriage and prolonged engagements were often impractical. But even by the standards of the time, the pace was fast. Within weeks of their first meeting, they were married. And then, almost immediately, the requests began. He needed her to sell the candy store. He needed the money from the sale to prepare their home for her arrival. He needed her savings, just temporarily, to settle certain debts before his father's money came through from Germany. There was always a reason. There was always a logical, sensible-sounding explanation for why the money needed to move from her possession to his, and why it needed to happen now, before he had actually delivered any of the things he had promised her. She sold the shop. She handed over $350 in savings. She waited for the home on Union Avenue that he had described in such careful detail, with the garden and the comfortable parlor and the life that was supposed to begin there. It was now December of 1904. The streets of Chicago were bitter with cold. The sky over the city sat low and gray. And in the rooms where Marie Walker now found herself, something was beginning to go very wrong. She started feeling ill. It began as discomfort, the kind you might attribute to a change in routine, to the stress of recent changes, to the body's natural response to upheaval. But it did not stay as discomfort. It deepened and darkened into something more insistent. Stomach pain that came in waves, violent and cramping. Nausea that offered no relief even after her stomach was empty. A burning sensation across her skin, as if something was happening beneath the surface that had no good explanation. And a thirst, an extreme and unrelenting thirst, that nothing she drank seemed to satisfy. She told her husband. He was sympathetic. He called a doctor. The doctor who came, a man named John Reese, examined her and arrived at a diagnosis. Bright's disease, he said. A kidney condition. Serious, but not entirely unmanageable. He prescribed treatment and went on his way. Marie did not get better. She got worse. And while she lay in that room, while her body struggled with something the doctor had not correctly identified, her husband was downstairs. And he was doing something that, when it later came to light, would stop people cold. He was talking to her sister. To Bertha. No, not Bertha. To Mrs. Fisher, another of Marie's widowed relatives who had come to help care for her. He was talking to this woman with a particular warmth and attention that had nothing to do with the concern of a worried husband. He was leaning close to her. He was making her feel, in the specific and practiced way that was his greatest skill, seen and valued, and perhaps a little special. At one point, he said to Mrs. Fisher, his voice low and intimate, words that she would later repeat to investigators with a kind of horrified disbelief. He said to her, "If I had only met you for weeks sooner." His wife was sick in the room upstairs. She was burning with something the doctor had not named correctly. She was thirsty in a way that nothing could satisfy. And the man who had promised to love and protect her was downstairs, laying the groundwork for what came next. Marie Walker died on January 12, 1905. She had been married to Johann Hock for less than 2 months. And within moments of her death, before the body was even prepared for burial, before the grief had had a single moment to settle, Johann Hock proposed to Mrs. Fisher. "If you are still awake, let that land for just a moment." His wife had just died. The warmth had not yet left the body, and he was already proposing marriage to the woman who had come to help care for her. Mrs. Fisher, stunned and perhaps more susceptible than she would have liked to be to a man who had just spent weeks making her feel special, did not immediately refuse. And 3 days after Marie Walker's funeral, 3 days, they married in secret in the nearby city of Joliet. He asked Mrs. Fisher for $1,000 to settle some pressing business matters. She withdrew $750 from her account. She handed it to him. She was now, in the same way Marie had been, in the process of being drained of everything she had. But something intervened, and that something was a sister who would not stay quiet. We will get there. But first, rest for just a moment. Let your breathing slow. The story is not going anywhere. You are safe in your bed, and the walls of your room are solid, and outside your window the world is continuing its slow and ordinary turning. Take a breath, and when you are ready, we will continue together. Bertha Sohn had watched all of this unfold with the particular alertness of a woman who loves her sister and who had perhaps never fully trusted the man that sister had married. There is a kind of intuition that exists between siblings, a frequency of communication that does not require words, and Bertha had been reading her sister's situation with growing unease from the moment Johann Hock had entered their lives. She had watched Marie grow pale and thin and confused during those final weeks. She had seen the way Marie's husband moved through the house, calm and unbothered, while the woman he had married lay struggling upstairs. And she had noticed, with the cold precision of grief, how quickly his attention had moved from her dying sister to the other women in the room. When Marie died, Bertha did not collapse into mourning. She did something more difficult and more important. She began to speak. She told people what she had observed. She said, plainly and with the kind of steadiness that comes from being absolutely certain of what you know, that Johann Hock had poisoned her sister, that the illness had come on too suddenly and too violently, that the man had behaved in ways that no husband in the grip of genuine grief would ever behave, that something was wrong, deeply wrong, and that she was not going to allow it to pass unquestioned. The Chicago police at this time were not entirely unaccustomed to suspicious deaths. Chicago in the early 20th century was a city of enormous complexity, densely populated and rapidly changing, with all the chaos and possibility that entails. Violent crime was common. Domestic violence was largely invisible, treated as a private matter between husbands and wives rather than a public concern. And poisoning, in particular, was notoriously difficult to detect in an era before sophisticated forensic chemistry was widely available. Doctors made mistakes. Diagnoses were imperfect. People died of kidney disease and stomach ailments and a dozen other conditions that could, if you knew what to look for, mask the presence of something introduced deliberately. But Bertha was persistent, and her accusations had enough specific detail, enough raw credibility, that the authorities agreed to take the next step. They ordered the exhumation of Marie Walker's body. The word exhumation carries its own weight, does it not? There is something in it that feels like a final indignity. The body pulled back from the earth before it has had a chance to return to it, subjected once more to the scrutiny and procedures of the living. But it is also, in cases like this, a form of justice. A way of letting the dead speak when no one listened closely enough while they were alive. The grave was opened in the frozen Chicago soil. The body of Marie Walker was examined by the coroner and his team with the full analytical attention that modern forensic chemistry, still relatively young but increasingly powerful in that era, could bring to bear. And what they found inside the stomach of this woman who had supposedly died of kidney disease was not ambiguous. 7.6 grains of arsenic. Not in her medicine, not in the embalming fluid, not in any of the substances that could theoretically explain its presence through innocent means. 7.6 grains of arsenic in the stomach of a woman who had spent her final weeks experiencing the precise and textbook symptoms of arsenic poisoning. Symptoms that her doctor had misidentified as Bright's disease, that her husband had watched develop without apparent alarm, and that had ultimately killed her while the man who shared her home was already making other arrangements. The case exploded. There is no other word for it. The Chicago newspapers, which in that era operated with a kind of energetic and somewhat lurid enthusiasm for crime stories, seized on this one with tremendous appetite. Headlines announced the discovery of the Blue Beard of Chicago. The name came from the old French fairy tale, the story of the nobleman who murdered his wives and hid their bodies in a locked room. A story so old and so persistent that it had become embedded in the cultural vocabulary as shorthand for a particular kind of domestic evil. The name fit Johann Hock with uncomfortable precision, and it stuck. But Johann Hock was already gone. He had disappeared from the house almost immediately after Mrs. Fisher's sister Bertha had begun making her accusations. He had that particular animal instinct of the long-practiced predator, the ability to sense when the environment was becoming dangerous and to move before the danger fully materialized. He packed whatever he needed. He took whatever money he had extracted from Mrs. Fisher, and he vanished from Chicago as completely as if the city had swallowed him. The police published his photograph. This was itself something of a significant step, circulating the image of a wanted man through newspapers and police bulletins in a time before electronic communication made such things instantaneous. His face, that ordinary round face with its tidy mustache and its expression of mild respectability, appeared in papers across the country. Citizens were asked to come forward if they recognized him. What happened next is one of those moments in a story where the sheer audacity of a criminal mind becomes almost difficult to process. Johann Hock, the most wanted man in Chicago, a man whose face was being circulated in newspapers, a man who had just poisoned his wife and bigamously married her sister within days of the funeral, traveled to New York City and, within approximately 24 hours of arriving there, began to court a new woman. He was operating under the alias Henry Bartels. He had taken a room in a boarding house, and the woman who ran that boarding house was exactly his type. She was a widow. She was of modest but comfortable means. She was lonely in that particular way that people who run boarding houses can be lonely, surrounded by transient strangers who come and go and never stay long enough to know. And he had walked into her establishment and smiled at her with those warm, practiced eyes, and within a day he had found a way to make her feel, in the specific gravitational way that was his greatest skill, like someone worth knowing. He proposed to her, 24 hours after arriving in her home. He was still proposing when the police walked in. The arrest, when it happened, was made by New York City detectives who had been alerted by the Chicago bulletins. They found Johann Hock in the boarding house, mid-courtship, wearing his latest alias like a well-fitted suit. He was calm when they approached him. That was noted by everyone who witnessed it. He did not panic. He did not make a run for it. He simply looked at the officers with the same mild and faintly resigned expression he might have worn if they had come to give him a parking fine. But then the search began. And it was during that search that the officers found something that transformed the arrest from a simple fugitive capture into something far more chilling. In his fountain pen, the elegant writing instrument that any respectable man of that era might carry, they found arsenic. 58 grains of arsenic, concealed inside the hollow of the pen. 58 grains. To give you some sense of the scale, 7.5 grains of arsenic had been sufficient to kill Marie Walker. He was carrying, in his pocket, enough poison to kill 7 more women. He offered several explanations for this, none of which held together under examination. First, he said it was tooth powder, a claim that collapsed immediately when the substance was tested. Then he said it was for his own use, that he had been contemplating suicide and had carried it for that purpose. This explanation also collapsed when investigators traced the purchase of the arsenic and found that the store he mentioned had no record of selling it to him. The most straightforward explanation, the one that nobody wanted to say out loud but that everyone was thinking, was that the arsenic in the fountain pen was his supply for the next wife. That he had been, at the moment of his arrest, mid-process. That the woman in the boarding house, the one he had proposed to within 24 hours of walking through her door, had been scheduled to become the next entry in a catalog of deaths that stretched back years. She had been saved by a bulletin board photograph and the watchfulness of New York City police. Back in Chicago, the investigation deepened with the kind of velocity that a sensational case generates when multiple agencies and jurisdictions suddenly begin comparing notes. And what emerged from that comparison was a picture of Johann Hoch's activities across nearly a decade that was, even for investigators who had seen considerable darkness in their careers, striking in its scope and its cold methodology. Women came forward. Former wives, former neighbors, women who had known him under different names in different cities, all of them with variations of the same story. The swift romance, the confident lies about money and property, the pressure to sell assets and hand over savings. And then, in some cases, the illness, the mysterious deterioration, the death that the doctors called kidney disease or stomach ailment, and that nobody had thought to question further because widows died of illness all the time, and besides, who had reason to question the grief of the man who sat beside the bed and held the dying woman's hand. Some of the women had survived. Some had escaped before whatever Hoch had planned for them could fully unfold, whether because they had kept enough of their money back, or because they had people in their lives who asked difficult questions, or simply because Hoch had decided the extraction was sufficient and moved on before resorting to more permanent measures. We will never know the precise calculus he used to decide which women died, and which ones he merely robbed and abandoned. But the calculus was real. The decisions were made. And across the trail of aliases and marriages and cities he had moved through, there were graves. How many graves? This is the question that haunts this case even now, more than a century later. The police at the time estimated he may have had as many as 50 wives across his career. Some historians of American crime have put the number of his suspected murder victims at anywhere from 6 to 20 or more. The truth is, in an era of fragmented records and incomplete communication between jurisdictions, the full scope of Johann Hoch's crimes is simply not recoverable. There are women whose deaths he caused who will never be connected to his name. There are widows who handed over their savings and spent the rest of their lives wondering what had happened to the man they had briefly believed in, never knowing that the same story had played out in a dozen other cities with a dozen other women. And in Chicago, in January of 1905, the investigation began to come together with the kind of momentum that only happens when a crime finally breaks into public awareness and the full weight of institutional attention falls upon it. 5 women who had been married to Johann Hoch, under various aliases, were brought together in an interrogation room to identify him. Their reunion, such as it was, produced scenes that witnesses later described as both tragic and astonishing. These women looked at each other across that room and saw, in each other's faces, the reflection of their own particular version of the same story. The same lies told with the same warmth and the same practiced sincerity. The same feeling of having been selected and seen and valued, followed by the same systematic erosion of everything they had. Some of them wept. Some of them were angry in a way that had nowhere adequate to go. And when Johann Hoch was brought into the room, when they were asked to confirm that this was the man, several of them reportedly erupted with a directness and a ferocity that the officers present found difficult to manage. Hoch, for his part, remained calm. He looked at these women with that infuriating composure, that quality of emotional imperviousness that had served him so well throughout his career, and he did not appear to find the situation particularly alarming. He had, by this point, been arrested before. He knew how to conduct himself in the presence of law enforcement. He knew that a display of distress or guilt would serve him poorly, and he declined to perform either. When investigators asked him why he had consistently targeted middle-aged widows, why this demographic, why these particular women, he gave an answer that was remarkable in its frankness and its complete absence of any detectable shame. He said they were easier to separate from their money. That was it. That was the whole of his explanation. Middle-aged widows were easier to separate from their money. As simple and practical a statement as if he had been asked why he preferred a particular brand of hat. They were easier. So he chose them. In a room full of law enforcement officials who had seen considerable varieties of human behavior, this statement apparently landed with a particular force. Not because it was unexpected, but because of the absolute flatness with which it was delivered. He was not boasting. He was not trying to shock. He was simply explaining his methodology with the matter-of-fact clarity of a businessman discussing his market. If you needed any further evidence that the warmth and attentiveness he had shown to all those women was performed rather than felt, that there had never been any emotion behind it, any real interest or care or feeling, this was it. They had been, to Johann Haack, not human beings but opportunities, vehicles for money, problems to be managed and then resolved. And the resolution, when other methods failed, was arsenic in a fountain pen. The trial that followed his arrest was one of the more closely watched criminal proceedings in Chicago in that era. The city was, by 1905, no stranger to sensational trials. It had produced more than its share of remarkable criminal cases, and its newspapers were fully prepared to cover this one with the level of detail and drama that their readers had come to expect. Johann Haack did not disappoint as a subject. He was composed on the stand, articulate, occasionally capable of a dry remark that his attorneys clearly wished he had restrained. He maintained, throughout the proceedings, the same quality of mild and faintly bemused detachment that had characterized his behavior since his arrest, as if the whole proceeding were slightly beneath him. The evidence against him, centered primarily on the arsenic found in Marie Walker's body, was substantial. The toxicological analysis was clear and well presented. The testimony of the examiners and the coroner was detailed and credible. And the pattern evidence, the accumulation of testimony from former wives and associates about his habits and methods, and the suspicious deaths and disappearances that followed his marriages, painted a portrait that left very little ambiguity about the kind of man the jury was being asked to evaluate. The verdict came on May 19, 1905. Guilty. He appealed. This is worth noting, because it tells you something about the confidence he maintained even after conviction. He appealed the verdict through the Illinois court system, and his appeals were funded in part by a woman named Miss Cora Wilson, who appears in this story as a figure of some puzzlement. She was not a former wife. She was apparently a woman who had become convinced, for reasons that are not entirely clear from the historical record, that Johann Haack had been wrongly convicted, or at least that he deserved legal representation and a fair examination of the evidence against him. Whether she understood his full history is uncertain. Whether she was herself another instance of his ability to inspire loyalty in women who might have been expected to know better, we cannot say. The appeals failed. The Illinois Supreme Court upheld the conviction. Every legal avenue was exhausted. On February 23, 1906, Johann Haack was executed. He went to his death with the same equanimity that had characterized everything else. No confession, no accounting for the full scope of what he had done. No list of names or cities or women who deserved to be found and acknowledged. No remorse of any kind that was visible to the people present. He simply ceased to be, with the same quiet efficiency with which he had moved through the world, taking what he needed and leaving behind only questions. Let the questions sit with you for a moment now, gently, the way questions do when you are lying in the dark and the night has gotten very quiet. How many women, really? How many graves across how many cities carry the name of someone who had believed in him and been made to pay for it with everything she had? How many doctors wrote kidney disease on a certificate and moved on to the next patient, never suspecting that the illness they had misnamed had been delivered by a man with a calm face and a warm German accent? How many women had survived him, had escaped with only their savings gone and their trust broken, and spent the rest of their lives unable to fully explain to anyone who asked what had happened to them in that particular chapter. These are not questions with clean answers. They are the kind of questions that history leaves open like windows in an empty house, letting in whatever weather there is. And they are important not because they lead anywhere conclusive, but because they keep the reality of these women in view, in the conversation where it belongs. Before we close this part of the story, take a moment just for Marie Walker, for the woman with the candy store on Willow Street who had built a careful and dignified life, who had allowed herself to hope, who had sold her shop and handed over her savings and believed, as honestly and fully as anyone has ever believed anything, that a new chapter was beginning. She deserved better than what she got. She deserved someone who meant the things he said to her. She deserved the home he described, the quiet evenings, the ordinary domestic comforts that are not glamorous but that matter enormously, that are the actual texture of a life well lived. She got arsenic instead, but she also got Bertha, her sister, who would not stay quiet, who pushed and accused and made enough noise to bring the full weight of the coroner's office down on that grave and let the truth come out of the frozen earth. If Bertha Sohn had said nothing, if she had folded into grief and let it go, Johann Hock might have gone on for years more. More cities, more aliases, more women who trusted him and died or were robbed and abandoned and never received any accounting at all. We honor both of them. Marie, for the life she built and the hope she allowed herself, which was an act of courage. And Bertha, for the courage of a different kind, the courage that speaks when speaking is difficult and costly, and there is no guarantee anyone will listen. If you are still awake, I want you to know that you have just spent this time honoring them too, simply by listening, by allowing their story to matter to you. That is not a small thing. In a world that moves quickly and forgets easily, the act of staying with a story, of letting real human lives occupy your attention for a little while, is its own form of respect. And now, let your breathing slow again. Let your body settle deeper into whatever softness is holding you. The night is still gentle outside your window. The story will continue, but you have all the time in the world. Rest for a moment if you need to. We are in no hurry here. Now let us go back further. Let us go back to before Marie Walker, before Chicago, before the advertisement in the Abend Post, and the candy store, and the arsenic in the stomach. Let us go back to the years when Johann Hock was still learning his trade, still refining the particular set of skills that would eventually make him, in the estimation of law enforcement and the press of the early 1900s, one of the most prolific marriage fraudsters and suspected serial killers that America had yet produced. Because he did not arrive in America fully formed as the monster the newspapers later described. No one does. There is always a beginning. Always a period of first experiments and small steps. Always the moment when a person discovers that a particular behavior works, that the world responds to it in ways that reward the person doing it, and that the rewards are significant enough to try it again. Understanding that beginning does not mean excusing what followed. It means giving the story its proper shape, its full depth, its honest accounting of how one person's particular combination of traits and circumstances and choices led to where it ultimately led. Johann Hock arrived in America in the early 1890s. He was in his early 30s. He spoke English with enough competence to navigate daily life, but his German was, of course, effortless and warm, and it was in German communities that he first found his footing. He settled for a time in Chicago, that great churning city on the edge of the lake, that place of constant construction and commerce and human possibility. Chicago in the 1890s was a city in the process of defining itself on the world stage. The World's Columbian Exposition had come and gone in 1893, leaving behind a city that had been forced to confront its own ambitions and had largely risen to meet them. The white city of the fair had been dismantled, but the pride remained, and with it a particular civic energy that attracted people from all over the world who wanted to be part of something large. The German community in Chicago was one of the largest and most established immigrant communities in the city. Germans had been coming to the American Midwest since the mid-1800s, and by the time Hock arrived, there were neighborhoods where you could spend an entire day speaking nothing but German. There were German newspapers, German churches, German social clubs, German mutual aid societies. It was a community that had worked very hard to establish itself, to earn respectability and security in a new country. And that community feeling, that mutual trust and recognition, was something that Hawk understood with the instinct of a predator who has identified the specific vulnerability of his environment. He knew that in a tight-knit immigrant community, a man who shared the language and the culture and certain surface markers of respectability would be trusted more quickly than a stranger. He knew that the women of these communities, particularly the widows, particularly those who had buried German immigrant husbands and found themselves navigating American life alone, would respond to the particular comfort of a man who reminded them of home, who knew the same songs, who perhaps had grown up near the same region, who ordered the same foods and understood the same unspoken codes of social behavior. He began to use this, and he was very good at it. His early movements are difficult to trace with precision because he had already begun using aliases by this point, and the fragmented nature of record-keeping in that era means that many of his early relationships and marriages left only partial traces, scattered across court documents, church records, and local newspaper archives in cities that had no particular reason to coordinate their information with each other. What historians have been able to piece together from these fragments suggests that by the mid-1890s, Hawk had already contracted multiple marriages and left behind a pattern of abandoned or mysteriously ill wives that, had anyone been looking carefully, would have been deeply alarming. There is the case of Martha Steinbucher, which comes up early in any accounting of his activities. The specific details of this relationship are somewhat murky, but what is known is that she died, and that before she died, she made statements suggesting she believed she had been poisoned. These statements were not taken with sufficient seriousness at the time. A dying woman accusing her husband of poisoning her was, in that era, the kind of claim that could easily be dismissed as delirium, as the confused utterances of a mind clouded by illness and fever, as the product of whatever the doctor had prescribed to make the dying comfortable. The claim was noted and set aside. Hawk moved on. There is Mary Rankin. There is Martha Hertzfield. There is Barbara Brossard, from whom he extracted her life savings before she disappeared from the record in the manner that suggests someone whose story was not considered worth pursuing. There is Clara Bartle, who died within months of marrying him. There is Julia Dose. There is Lena Hawk, who died in weeks. Each of these women appears in the reconstructed history of his activities as a name and a few sparse facts. The brevity of their entries a measure of how little attention was paid to them in their time, how thoroughly the lives of middle-aged immigrant widows could unfold and conclude without leaving much of a mark on the official record. This is not an accident. This is not simply the result of record-keeping imperfections in the late 19th century. This is the specific exploitation of a structural invisibility that existed around certain women in that period. Older women, immigrant women, women without prominent family connections or significant social capital, women whose deaths could be attributed to the usual suspects of the era, kidney disease, heart failure, the catch-all of stomach ailments, without generating any meaningful investigation. Johann Hawk understood this invisibility the way a locksmith understands the particular weakness of a type of lock. He had found the door that nobody was guarding, and he walked through it, repeatedly, for the better part of a decade. To understand this fully, you need to understand something about the position of women, particularly widowed women, in American society at the turn of the 20th century. The economic reality was stark. Widowhood, for a woman of modest means in that era, was a genuine crisis. There was no social safety net, no government assistance, no insurance industry sophisticated enough to protect the average household. If your husband died and you did not have family to help support you, you faced a very difficult set of choices. You could work, and there were certain jobs available to women of that class: domestic service, piecework in garment factories, running a small business as Marie Walker had done, but these provided subsistence at best and could be exhausting and precarious. Or you could remarry, which offered financial stability, but required finding someone willing and able to provide it. This created a particular desperation that Hawk knew how to read and exploit. He was not offering these women romance in the abstract. He was offering them the specific and practical thing they most needed, which was security. A home. A stable income. The promise that the terrifying precariousness of widowhood was behind them now, that they could stop calculating how long their savings would last and start simply living. He packaged this offer in the language of attraction and affection, which made it both more believable and more appealing than a purely transactional proposal would have been. But underneath the romance, underneath the warm eyes and the German accent and the promise of a wealthy father in the old country, the essential transaction was security for money, and the women who responded to his advertisements were responding, at least in part, to the material reality of their situation. He knew this. He had reduced them, in his own mind, to their most legible economic dimension. They were not complex human beings with interior lives and histories and individual hopes. They were widows with savings. They were problems that could be solved for a period of time and then converted into assets. This is the thing that makes Johann Haack uniquely disturbing, not just as a criminal figure, but as a historical and psychological one. It was not passion that drove him. It was not the kind of explosive emotional dysregulation that characterizes many violent crimes, the anger or jealousy or grief that suddenly overwhelms a person's capacity for restraint. He was not a man undone by feeling. He was the opposite. He was a man who had apparently eliminated feeling as a relevant variable entirely, who had arrived at a place of such thorough detachment from the humanity of the people around him that he was able to plan and execute the deaths of women he had slept beside, shared meals with, listened to as they described their hopes and their histories, with no more apparent internal conflict than a merchant conducting an inventory. This is what the psychological literature on serial offenders calls instrumental violence. Violence, or in this case poisoning, used not as an expression of emotion but as a practical tool in service of a goal. The goal, in Haack's case, was money. The women were not objects of hatred or desire or any other recognizable emotional category. They were simply obstacles, once they had served their purpose, and the most efficient way to remove an obstacle was arsenic. The arsenic itself deserves a moment of attention here, because in the early 20th century it occupied a peculiar and revealing place in both domestic life and criminal history. Arsenic trioxide, the specific compound most commonly used, was in that era not a tightly regulated substance. It was available in pharmacies and general stores, sold under the guise of rat poison or household pest control, and its purchase did not require any particular documentation or explanation. You walked in, you asked for it, you paid for it, you walked out. It was cheap, it was widely available, and, crucially, it was in that period somewhat difficult to detect with the analytical techniques available to most physicians. The symptoms of arsenic poisoning, those violent stomach pains, the nausea, the burning sensations, the extreme thirst, could mimic a remarkable range of other conditions. In an era before routine toxicological analysis, before the chemical tests that could definitively identify arsenic in a body had been widely adopted and understood, a doctor who examined a woman with these symptoms and concluded that she had kidney disease or gastroenteritis or any number of other conditions would not have been considered negligent. He would have been working with the tools he had, applying the diagnostic framework of his training to symptoms that genuinely resembled common illnesses. This is why arsenic was called, in that era, the inheritance powder. It was the poison of domestic predators, of people who needed someone to die quietly and at home without raising alarm, who needed the death to look like illness rather than crime. Women had used it throughout European history to dispatch inconvenient husbands, a fact that the historical record reflects with uncomfortable regularity. Men had used it to inherit money from wives. Parents had, in documented cases that made their way into the newspapers of the era, used it on children who were inconvenient or competitive for limited family resources. It was the chemistry of intimate murder, the poison of people who lived with their victims, who had access to their food and drink, who could administer it slowly over days or weeks in amounts too small to create immediate alarm. Johann Haack was an expert in its use. Not because he had studied chemistry formally, there is no evidence of that, but because he had learned empirically, through practice, how much was needed and how to administer it in a way that allowed the illness to develop along a plausible natural timeline. 7.5 grains in Marie Walker, a dose calibrated, it appears, to be lethal but not immediately so, allowing a period of illness that the doctor could mistake for something other than poison, allowing time for the story to develop naturally before the conclusion arrived. While you let that settle, understand that arsenic in those quantities is not a quick death. It is a painful one. Marie Walker spent weeks in that room, burning and vomiting and thirsty in a way that nothing satisfied, while the man she had married sat downstairs and laid the groundwork for what came next. She did not know what was happening to her. She trusted the doctor's diagnosis. She trusted the man who came upstairs to sit with her and hold her hand with an expression of concern on his face. She had no framework for understanding that the illness was not random, not a cruelty of fate, but the deliberate and premeditated work of the person she had chosen to build her life with. That particular isolation, the isolation of not knowing, adds a layer of cruelty to what he did that is hard to sit with. She was not just dying. She was dying in confusion, in trust, in the specific vulnerability of a person who believes they are cared for while something unspeakable is being done to them. And while she died in that confusion, Hawk was already thinking about what came next. Mrs. Fisher, the sister-in-law who had come to help nurse Marie, was a widow. She had some means. She was, in the specific way that mattered to him, another opportunity. He began working on her before Marie was even gone, laying the emotional groundwork, making her feel that particular quality of attention that was his most effective tool. And when Marie died, he moved so quickly that it still shocks to read about it. A proposal within moments of death. A secret marriage 3 days after the funeral. Arsenic already in the fountain pen for when the money ran out, and the next step became necessary. Mrs. Fisher survived, not because Hawk had any particular mercy in him, but because Bertha Sohn had a voice and the courage to use it. The accusation came before he could complete the process. His instincts for self-preservation overrode the next planned step. He ran. But before he ran, before Bertha's voice had time to translate into official action, he had already extracted $750 from Mrs. Fisher. She had gone to the bank and withdrawn it. She had handed it to him. And in those final hours before his disappearance, she had been in the same position that all his wives had been in before her, positioned exactly where he needed her to be, her money moving in his direction, her trust operating as designed. She was lucky. She would spend the rest of her life understanding how lucky she was, and what it was that had stood between her and her sister's fate. This luck, this particular version of it, the luck of having a Bertha, the luck of having someone in your life who would not look away and would not stay quiet, is worth thinking about as you lie in the quiet of your room tonight. Because so many of the women who moved through Johann Hawk's life did not have a Bertha, did not have someone positioned closely enough, alert enough, brave enough to say, "This does not look right, this does not feel right, and I am not going to let it pass without a fight." The women who had no Bertha are the ones whose names we may never know. The ones who appear only as absences in the record, as dates of death beside marriages to a man traveling under a name we cannot now connect to the one we know. They are there, in the historical silence. We cannot count them precisely, but we know they exist, and the knowing is its own kind of witness. If you are still with me, still listening in the warm dark of wherever you are tonight, take a slow breath now. In through the nose. Hold it gently for just a moment, and let it go. The story continues. But there is no rush. You are held by whatever is holding you, and the night around you is soft. Let the quiet do what it does best. We have more to tell. We have the interrogation room, and the 5 women, and the trial, and the execution that followed. We have the legacy, the unanswered questions, the historical reverberations of what one man did to many women in the immigrant communities of a changing America. We will get there slowly. But for now, let the breathing slow a little more. Let the weight of the day release from your body, a little at a time. The way snow falls from a branch when the branch finally bends under the accumulation, not all at once, but in small and successive surrenders to gravity. You are safe. The story is here when you are ready. We are in no hurry. There is something that the history books do not always pause to consider. Something that gets lost in the momentum of detective work and courtroom drama, and the satisfying narrative arc of a predator finally caught. And that is the specific texture of the trust that Johann Hawk violated. Not just the trust of individual women, though that alone would be more than enough to condemn him, but the trust of an entire community, a community that had worked very hard to build something fragile and valuable in a country that was not always welcoming to people who came from elsewhere, who spoke other languages, who carried different customs and different memories. The German immigrant communities of the American Midwest in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were remarkable social structures. They had built churches and schools, newspapers and mutual aid societies, cultural organizations, and professional associations. They had created, in the middle of a new world that could be alienating and unpredictable, dense webs of connection and support that allowed people to navigate the difficulties of immigrant life with something approximating the safety of community. You could go to a German church and hear a service in your own language. You could go to a German social club and meet people who understood your jokes. You could read a newspaper in German and feel, for an hour, less fundamentally foreign. And this infrastructure of community created, necessarily, a certain quality of internal trust. When you met someone at a German church, or through a German social club, or through a German-language newspaper advertisement, there was an implicit endorsement in the connection, a sense that this person was part of the same world you were part of, which meant something. Which meant you could extend a degree of trust that you might not extend to a complete stranger encountered in a less communally mediated context. Johann Haack weaponized this trust with deliberate precision. He did not drift randomly into these communities. He targeted them. He placed his advertisements in German-language newspapers specifically. He moved in social circles where his German-language skills and his knowledge of German culture and customs would mark him as familiar, trustworthy, someone whose background could be assumed rather than established. He understood that in a community operating on the basis of shared origin and shared language, his fluency in those things functioned as a credential, a shorthand for a shared history that could substitute for actual personal knowledge. This is a form of exploitation that has a particular sting to it, beyond the individual cruelty of what he did to each woman. He was not just stealing from them. He was using the very mechanisms of mutual support and community trust, mechanisms that those communities had built with great effort and care precisely to protect their members, as the instrument of his predation. He was turning the community against itself. He was making the thing that was supposed to protect these women into the thing that exposed them to danger. And the women who met him through those community channels would have had no particular reason to be suspicious on that basis alone. The fact that he had been introduced through a community institution was supposed to mean something, was supposed to provide a level of vetting, was supposed to mean that this person had been, at some level, seen and known by people you trusted. The community connection was precisely the thing that made his lies plausible. Let us spend some time now with some of the earlier women in his trail, the ones who came before Marie Walker, the ones whose names appeared in the reconstructed timeline of his activities as the investigators in Chicago began to piece together the full scope of what they were dealing with. These women are less documented than Marie, their stories filtered through second-hand accounts and incomplete records, but they deserve to be named, and their stories, such as we know them, deserve to be told. Barbara Brossart was a woman who appears in the record in connection with Johann Haack sometime in the mid to late 1890s. She had savings. She had accumulated them carefully over years of work, the kind of patient and disciplined saving that requires real sacrifice in the day-to-day. She was, by all accounts, a practical and capable woman who had survived difficulties and built a small but meaningful financial cushion for herself. She met Haack, or a man presenting himself under one of his aliases, through what appears to have been a community connection. The courtship was swift. The marriage followed quickly. And then, in the pattern that recurred across his entire career, her savings were gone. Whether Haack merely robbed Barbara Brossart and abandoned her, or whether something worse happened, is not entirely clear from the available record. What is clear is that after the marriage and the extraction of her savings, she disappears from the trail in the way that suggests a story that was never fully told. She may have survived him, impoverished and humiliated, another woman who had been reduced to a cautionary tale that nobody at the time recognized as part of a pattern. Or she may not have survived. The historical record does not resolve this, and the uncertainty is itself a kind of testimony. Clara Bartle. She died within months of marrying him. The cause of death in the record is listed as something consistent with natural causes, one of those vague categories that served as a catch-all in an era when autopsies were not routine and the death of a middle-aged woman from apparent illness generated little systematic inquiry. She had been healthy before the marriage. The decline, when it came, was rapid. Those who knew her noted that the symptoms were severe and seemed inconsistent with the illness her doctor had diagnosed. But these observations were made in passing, mentioned in conversation, never translated into the kind of official scrutiny that would have required examining the body for what was actually there. She is a ghost in this story, a name attached to a timeline attached to a man who moved on without apparent difficulty. She had probably believed, the way so many of these women had believed, that she was entering a new chapter. She had probably had small specific hopes, the particular and modest ones that people who have been through difficulty allow themselves. She had been wrong in the way that only the most thorough betrayal makes you wrong about the most fundamental thing. Lena Hawk. The fact that she shared his name tells you that at some point he married her with sufficient formality to give her that surname. She died in weeks. The brevity of the timeline is stunning even in this context, where the timelines are generally brief. She was married and widowed, if she had any family who thought of it in those terms, in the space of what might be a single month. She had no time to settle into the marriage, no time to discover his lies and begin to question them, no time to consult a Bertha or anyone else who might have seen what was happening clearly enough to intervene. She was simply gone. These women, and the others like them whose names do not appear in any available record because they were never connected to Hawk, or because their deaths were attributed to natural causes without sufficient investigation, represent the full weight of what this man did. Not just the individual tragedies, which would be terrible enough, but the accumulated evidence of a systematic predation that operated for nearly a decade before anyone stopped it. That duration, that sustained operation across multiple states and multiple aliases, speaks to something important about the systems, or lack of systems, that were supposed to protect people. There was no national database of suspicious deaths. There was no mechanism by which a coroner in Cincinnati could compare notes with a police captain in Milwaukee about deaths that followed a similar pattern. There was no interstate law enforcement cooperation of the kind that, in a later era, would allow investigators to connect cases that happened hundreds of miles apart. Each city's police department operated in relative isolation, dealing with the cases in its own jurisdiction, with no particular capacity or incentive to wonder whether a suspicious death in another city might be connected to a suspicious death in their own. Hawk understood this. It is almost impossible to believe that he did not, at some level, understand the structural invisibility that allowed him to operate. He kept moving. He maintained the aliases with discipline. He chose cities that were close enough together to be accessible, but far enough apart that the newspaper coverage in one would not routinely reach the other. He chose women who were embedded enough in a community to be accessible through those community channels, but not so prominent that their deaths would generate the kind of sustained public attention that might prompt cross-jurisdictional inquiry. He had thought about this, not in the way that strategic planners think, with charts and formal analysis, but in the way that a certain kind of predatory intelligence thinks, through accumulated experience, through the gradual refinement of a system that works, through the instinctive reading and exploitation of the specific vulnerabilities of an environment. And it had worked. For years, it had worked. Let us turn back to Chicago now, to the weeks following the exhumation of Marie Walker and the publication of Hawk's photograph in newspapers across the country. Because in those weeks, something interesting happened. Something that speaks to the peculiar celebrity that attached itself to violent criminals in the popular press of the early 20th century, and to the way that celebrity could complicate justice even as it assisted in the identification and capture of someone who needed to be stopped. The newspapers had given Johann Hawk the name Bluebeard. They had run his photograph alongside breathless accounts of his marriages and the suspected deaths that had followed them. They had published estimates of the number of women he might have married, these estimates ranging from a plausible 15 to an almost certainly inflated 50, in the way that newspaper reporting of that era tended to round up in the direction of drama. And in doing so, they had made him into a kind of figure, a myth, a Victorian bogeyman in a tidy mustache who had walked through the immigrant communities of the Midwest with poison in his fountain pen and charming lies on his lips. This mythologization did certain useful things. It spread his image far enough that New York City police officers recognized him when he arrived there under his alias. It generated a public conversation about the vulnerability of widows, about the use of matrimonial advertisements, about the reliability of the German-language press as a safe venue for personal advertisements. It produced, in other words, Exactly the kind of social awareness that might prevent the next Johann Hock from operating with the same impunity. But it also did something less useful. It turned Johann Hock himself into a slightly glamorous figure, a monster of such audacious scope and such brazen consistency that the narrative of his crimes became, despite the genuine horror of what he had done, slightly spectacular. Spectacular in a way that the actual lives of his victims were not. Marie Walker and Barbara Brossart and Clara Bartle and Lena Hock were not spectacular. They were ordinary. They were living ordinary lives, doing ordinary work, hoping ordinary hopes. And the spectacular story of the man who had deceived and murdered them tended to expand into the space of the telling in a way that left the women themselves slightly compressed. This is a problem that true crime storytelling has wrestled with since the genre began. The tendency for the perpetrator to become the narrative center while the victims, whose lives and deaths are the actual substance of the story, recede into the background. It happens not because storytellers are callous, but because the mechanics of narrative pull toward complexity and mystery, and the predator, with all his aliases and systems and cold calculations, is more apparently complex than his victims, whose stories, once they have been reduced to victimhood, seem to tell themselves in a single register. But the victims are not simple. They are not one thing. They are people whose full lives existed before they encountered Johann Hock, and whose full lives would have continued after him had they been given the chance to live them. Marie Walker had opinions and memories and preferences and small private fears that had nothing to do with the man who killed her. Barbara Brossart had a particular way of moving through her days that was entirely her own. Lena Hock had a history that existed before the name she briefly shared with the man who may have ended her life. They were not their endings. They were their entire lives. And their entire lives deserve the space in this story that their endings so easily claim. As you rest with all of this, as the story settles into the quiet space around you and the night deepens, I want you to hold that thought for a moment. These women were not footnotes. They were the story. Johann Hock was the interruption. Now, the investigation in Chicago was moving quickly in those early weeks of 1905. The police had the arsenic evidence from the exhumation. They had Bertha Sohn's testimony. They had the pattern of behavior that was becoming clearer as more former wives and associates came forward. And they had, crucially, Hock's photographs circulating across the country, the same round face and tidy mustache in every newspaper that ran it. When word came from New York that a man matching the description had been arrested in a boarding house, still in the process of proposing to the owner, with arsenic in his fountain pen, the Chicago investigators began the process of extradition. This process involved the particular complexity of interstate law, of jurisdictional claims and procedural requirements, and it unfolded over a period of weeks rather than days. During this period, Johann Hock sat in a New York City jail cell with a composure that various accounts describe as remarkable even by the standards of hardened criminals. He read, he ate, he slept. He conversed with guards and fellow inmates with the same mild sociability he had apparently always carried. He was not a man who raged. He was not a man who paced or wept or descended into the visible distress of guilt. He was, by all contemporary accounts, simply present in the situation with the same equanimity that had characterized all the rest of it, as if the arrest and the jail cell and the looming trial were events happening slightly apart from him rather than to him. This quality of detachment, is one of the more distinctive characteristics noted across the historical accounts of his case. It was noted by police officers who interviewed him, by journalists who were given access to him, by the courtroom observers who watched him during the trial. It was not coldness exactly, or not coldness in the way we usually mean the word. He was not unfriendly or hostile. He engaged with people, answered questions, occasionally offered remarks that were dry or even faintly humorous. But there was a quality beneath all of that of something simply not being there. Some essential human register that most people carry in obvious form. The register of guilt, of consequence, of the weight of other people's lives and deaths, seemed simply not to be present in him. Whether this reflects a specific psychological condition, the kind of thing that a later era's diagnostic vocabulary would have named with clinical precision, or whether it reflects something more prosaic about the particular self-deceptions that allowed a person to do what he did, we cannot say with confidence. The psychology of criminal behavior was not in 1905 the sophisticated analytical discipline it would become, and the people who examined and interviewed Johann Haack were not doing so through a systematic psychological lens, but rather through the practical lens of law enforcement and journalism, trying to understand what they had caught rather than why it existed. What they had caught was this: a man who had married with deliberate fraud, who had poisoned at least one woman and was strongly suspected of having poisoned more, who had maintained a supply of arsenic for the next murder and had been in the process of initiating the next courtship at the moment of his arrest. That was enough to proceed with. The deeper questions, the why and how of the psychology, would have to remain, for the time being and perhaps forever, unanswered. If you are still listening, still drifting in the warm quiet of where you are, let the questions float up and then release them. They do not need to be answered tonight. They can simply be held, like objects found on a walk, examined briefly and then set down, their weight acknowledged without being carried. You have been a good and patient listener. You have stayed with this story through its difficult parts and its quiet parts. You have let these women, Marie and Bertha and the ones before them, have some of your attention, which is a form of honor. Let yourself rest now in the knowledge that you have done something real tonight, simply by listening. The story continues, but there is no urgency in it. Let your breathing slow, let your body soften, let the night do what nights do best. We will still be here. We are going nowhere. The extradition from New York to Chicago was completed in the early weeks of 1905, and when Johann Haack was brought back to the city where Marie Walker had died, the attention of the press and the public had reached a kind of sustained intensity that is difficult to fully imagine from this distance. The story had everything that made early 20th century newspapers want to keep running it. It had poison and disguise and the violation of domestic trust. It had a villain who was simultaneously dangerous and pathetically ordinary looking. It had victims who generated sympathy, immigrant women who had worked hard and hoped carefully and been destroyed by their own openness to trust. And it had, in Johann Haack himself, an inexhaustible source of copy, because he was a man who would talk, who would engage with reporters, who seemed to find the attention neither gratifying nor threatening, but simply the current situation he was navigating. He gave interviews. This is worth pausing on. While awaiting trial on charges that carried the death penalty, he gave interviews to newspaper reporters in which he discussed his life and his marriages with a candor that was, by any measure, extraordinary. He did not confess to murder in these interviews. He was not suicidal or reckless in the legal sense. But he also did not retreat into silence or refuse to engage. He talked. He talked about the women he had married, about his methods of finding and approaching them, about his philosophy, if that is the right word for it, of targeting middle-aged widows. He told reporters that he had found middle-aged women easier to manage, easier to convince, more susceptible to the particular combination of attention and promise that was his primary tool. He said this with the same flat practicality that he had used when telling investigators that they were easier to separate from their money. There was no cruelty in his tone when he said these things, no relish in the objectification of the women he had targeted. It was as if he were simply describing an observation about human behavior that he had made empirically and had proceeded to act upon, the way a farmer might describe having noticed that a particular variety of seed does better in a particular type of soil. The reporters who interviewed him found this quality deeply unsettling. They expected something more dramatically readable, the defiant killer who glares at the camera, or the tearful penitent overcome by remorse, or even the calculating schemer who smiles because he believes he is smarter than everyone in the room. What they found was none of those things. They found a man who was entirely present in the conversation, who answered questions directly, who demonstrated clear intelligence and a functional grasp of his own situation, but who simply did not appear to experience any of the emotional registers that the situation seemed to demand. No guilt, no fear, no pride, just the flat and functional intelligence of a man doing what needed to be done in the current moment. One reporter, whose account was published in a Chicago paper in the spring of 1905, described the experience of interviewing Haack as follows, paraphrasing rather than quoting. He said it was like talking to a man who had been assembled to resemble a person, but from whom some essential component had been omitted, some piece of the mechanism that was supposed to generate human feeling when confronted with the consequences of human action. He said it was the most disturbing interview he had ever conducted, not because anything threatening was said, but because of the specific quality of nothing that was there behind the eyes. This description would not have surprised the women who had married him, the ones who survived long enough to reflect on it afterward, because what they had experienced, in the aftermath of whatever he had done to them or taken from them, was precisely the retroactive recognition of that nothing. The warmth they had felt from him during the courtship, the sense of being seen and known and valued that he had generated so skillfully, had not been warmth at all. It had been a performance, an extremely sophisticated and calibrated performance, but a performance nonetheless. And understanding that, trying to square it with the memory of how real it had felt, was the particular and enduring damage he left in the lives of the women he had used. The trial began in the spring of 1905 before a packed courtroom in Chicago. The case against Hawk was built primarily around the death of Marie Walker, because her case was the most thoroughly documented and the most recently investigated, and because the forensic evidence of the arsenic in her stomach was clear and specific and difficult to explain away. The prosecution proceeded methodically, presenting the timeline of the marriage, the financial manipulations, the onset of Marie's illness, the doctor's misdiagnosis, the death, and then the exhumation and the definitive discovery of arsenic in quantities consistent with deliberate poisoning. The defense, for its part, was in a genuinely difficult position. The arsenic was real. The quantity was lethal. The symptoms of Marie's illness were consistent with arsenic poisoning and inconsistent with Bright's disease. The circumstantial pattern of Hawk's behavior, marrying quickly, extracting money, proposing to the sister within moments of the death, fleeing the city before the body was even examined, was not flattering. And the fountain pen arsenic, discovered in New York, was perhaps the most damaging piece of evidence of all, because it suggested not a one-time crime committed in a moment of passion or desperation, but a systematic and ongoing operation. A man who carried his tools with him because he expected to use them again. The defense tried to suggest that the arsenic could have entered Marie's body through other means. It tried to challenge the toxicological analysis and the chain of custody of the samples. It pointed to the earlier diagnosis of Bright's disease as an alternate explanation for her death. None of these arguments found significant purchase with the jury, which had the advantage of considering the full weight of the evidence rather than any single piece of it. The verdict, delivered on May 19, 1905, was guilty. When the foreman read the word, when that single syllable dropped into the silence of the packed courtroom, the reaction was not the explosion of cheering or weeping that popular accounts of dramatic trials often describe. It was, by most accounts, something more muted. A release of held breath. A collective exhale. The recognition that something had been correctly named, that the word guilty had been applied to a thing that was genuinely and thoroughly guilty, and that this was, for all its inadequacy in the face of what had been done to Marie Walker and to the others before her, better than the alternative. Hawk himself, when the verdict was read, showed what he always showed. Nothing. Or rather, nothing beyond the mild and faintly procedural attention of a man tracking the development of a situation that affected him but did not, apparently, distress him. He looked at the jury. He absorbed the verdict. He was led away. He continued, in subsequent days and weeks, to occupy his jail cell with the same equanimity that he had occupied every other space in his life. He appealed. The appeal was structured around technical and procedural grounds rather than any substantive claim of innocence. His legal team argued that certain evidence had been improperly admitted, that the jury instructions had been inadequate, that the trial had not proceeded with sufficient fairness in certain specific respects. These are the standard arguments of appeals in capital cases, and they are not without merit as a class of argument. Every person convicted of a crime deserves to have that conviction carefully reviewed for procedural correctness. This is not a courtesy. It is a foundation of a just legal system. But the Illinois Supreme Court, reviewing the case with the full weight of its appellate function, did not find the appeal persuasive. The conviction was upheld. The death sentence stood. Now, here is where a woman enters this story whose role is worth examining. Her name was Cora Wilson, and she is not a victim of Johann Hawk in any of the ways that the women before her were victims. She was not widowed and lonely and targeted through a matrimonial advertisement. She was apparently a woman of independent resources and decided opinions, a woman who had become, through some process that the historical record does not fully illuminate, convinced that Johann Hock had been treated unjustly by the legal system and deserved either acquittal or at minimum a more rigorous defense. She funded his appeals. She wrote to him. She visited him in jail. She became, in the parlance of a later era, something approaching an advocate for him, or at least for the proposition that his case warranted further scrutiny. The newspapers, which were watching every dimension of this case with close attention, were predictably fascinated by this development. Here was yet another woman, they pointed out with varying degrees of delicacy, who had come under the spell of Johann Hock, this time not through a matrimonial advertisement, but through the peculiar magnetism of a convicted murderer whose story had filled the papers for months. Whether Cora Wilson was operating from genuine belief in his innocence or from something else, something more complicated and less easily categorized, nobody could be certain. She was not without intelligence, by all accounts, and the idea that she had simply been deceived in the way that his murder victims had been deceived seems difficult to sustain, given that she had access to the full account of his crimes as published in the press. She knew what he had done, or at least what he had been convicted of doing, and she involved herself in his case anyway. There is a category of human behavior that this represents, the attachment to the condemned criminal, the insistence on maintaining a connection to a person whom the rest of society has definitively judged and condemned, that psychologists and criminologists have written about extensively in the century since Hock's execution. It is not simple. It is not easily explained by any single factor. It involves the particular human capacity for seeing what you want to see in another person, for building an image of someone that resists revision even in the face of substantial evidence that the image is wrong. It involves, sometimes, the desire to be exceptional, to be the one person who sees what others have missed, to have a connection to someone that nobody else has or can understand. It involves, occasionally, something close to genuine compassion, the impulse to extend human recognition to someone who has been categorized as less than human. Whatever drove Cora Wilson, the appeals she funded did not succeed. The conviction held. The sentence held. And on February 23, 1906, Johann Hock was executed. The execution was conducted in the manner customary for the time and place. He was asked, in the final hours, whether he wished to make any statement about the full extent of his crimes, whether he wished to provide investigators with a list of the women he had married and the women he had harmed. He declined this invitation with the same polite composure that had characterized all of his interactions with the legal system. He made no confession. He named no additional victims. He offered no accounting. He simply prepared for what was coming with the same flat and unbothered attention he had brought to everything else. And then he was gone. And the question of how many women he had killed, which was already a question before his execution, became a question that could never now be fully answered. The investigators who had built the case against him had done their best to reconstruct his trail. They had gathered testimony from former wives and associates. They had connected certain deaths in certain cities to the pattern of behavior they had documented. They had arrived, through careful and painstaking work, at a set of confirmed and suspected victims that represented the most conservative possible accounting of what he had done. 6 women were considered strong murder suspects by the investigators involved in the Chicago case, based on the combination of forensic evidence and pattern behavior. But the investigators themselves acknowledged that the number 6 was almost certainly an underestimate, that the fragmented records and limited interstate communication of the era meant that there were deaths he had caused that had never been formally examined, never been connected to him, never been given even the inadequate justice of public naming. 20 is a number that some crime historians have suggested as a more realistic minimum. Others have said 30. The newspapers, prone to the drama of the largest possible number, held to 50. The truth is that nobody knows, and nobody will ever know. The graves are there, scattered across the Midwest and possibly elsewhere, and in them are women whose deaths were attributed to kidney disease and stomach ailments and the general fragility of middle-aged bodies. And some number of those women were actually victims of a man with a fountain pen full of arsenic who had moved on before anyone thought to ask the right questions. This not knowing is its own kind of suffering. It sits in the record like a wound that did not quite close, like a door that was never fully opened to see what was behind it. And it is worth sitting with. because it points to something important about the conditions that allowed Johann Haack to operate for as long as he did. It was not just his intelligence or his skill or his specific knowledge of how to use arsenic. It was the structural invisibilities, the lack of communication between jurisdictions, the cultural tendency to underinvest in the lives of certain kinds of women, the medical limitations of an era before routine toxicological screening, the social norms around widowhood that made it both common and somewhat unremarkable. All of these things together created the environment in which he could move. Understanding that is not about excusing him. Nothing excuses him. It is about seeing the full picture clearly, about refusing to let the case be only about the monster and ignoring the context that shaped the monster's opportunities. Because the women he targeted were not randomly vulnerable. They were specifically, structurally vulnerable, in ways that reflected real deficiencies in how society protected people like them. And those deficiencies were not unique to the late 19th century. They have analogs in every era, including the current one. The forms change. The populations at risk change. The specific mechanisms of exploitation change. But the underlying reality, that certain people are more exposed to certain kinds of predation because of who they are and what their social position allows for, does not change. Johann Haack knew exactly who to target. The question that matters, the one that extends beyond his particular case into the larger world, is whether the rest of us know how to see and protect the people he would have chosen. Let that question settle softly, like a leaf finding its way to still water. It does not demand an answer tonight. It simply asks to be held. And you, in your quiet room with the night soft around you, have been holding this story with care and patience, and something that I think is genuine compassion for the women whose names we have spoken tonight. Marie, Barbara, Clara, Lena, Bertha, who survived and saved. Mrs. Fisher, who barely escaped. The unnamed ones in the cities we cannot trace. You have given them your attention, and that is not a small thing. Breathe now, in and out. Let the weight of it settle without pressing. You are still here, and they are remembered, and the night is gentle, and there is more to this story, but none of it is urgent. Let yourself drift if you are ready to drift. Let the quiet come for you. And now, if you are still with us, if the story has kept you company in the dark and you are still awake and listening, let us go deeper into one particular aspect of this case that does not get enough attention in the standard telling. We have talked about the women. We have talked about the arsenic and the aliases and the pattern that repeated across cities and years. But there is one dimension of this story that speaks very directly to the question of how Johann Haack was finally stopped, and it has to do with a relatively new technology that was, in the early 1900s, just beginning to transform the landscape of criminal investigation. Photography. The circulation of Johann Haack's photograph in January and February of 1905, after the Chicago police issued the bulletin that led to his identification and arrest in New York, was one of the earliest high-profile examples of what we now think of as the wanted poster in its modern form. The systematic distribution of a criminal's physical likeness across a wide geographic area in the expectation that someone, somewhere, would recognize it and report to authorities. This was made possible by the printing technology of the era, which could reproduce photographic images in newspapers with sufficient fidelity that a person who had met Johann Haack under one of his aliases would be able to look at the newspaper photograph and say with confidence, "That is him." And that is exactly what happened. The boarding house owner in New York City where Haack had been arrested did not know his real name. She had known him only as Henry Bartels, the warm and attentive gentleman who had proposed to her within 24 hours of walking through her door. But when she saw the photograph in the newspaper, when she looked at that round face and tidy mustache, she recognized the man she had been on the verge of agreeing to marry. And the recognition, the cold and specific shock of understanding that she had nearly made the same mistake that Marie Walker had made, probably saved her life. There is something worth noting in this about the role of the press in the case. The newspaper coverage that had made Johann Haack into a celebrity criminal, that had run his photograph and called him Bluebeard and estimated the number of his victims at numbers ranging from 15 to 50, was not unmixedly positive in its effects. It generated sensationalism. It turned the deaths of women into entertainment. It sometimes compressed the individuality of the victims into the category of victim in ways that were reductive and unsatisfying. But it also put his face in every parlor in the country that subscribed to a major newspaper. And that, in the end, was what stopped him. There is a lesson in there about the double-edged quality of media attention in criminal cases, about the tension between the legitimate need to inform and protect the public and the tendency toward the exploitative dramatization of suffering that the media industry has never fully resolved and probably never will. But in January of 1905, the newspapers did something genuinely useful. They published a face, and the face was recognized. Let us now turn to something that the investigators in Chicago found particularly significant, which is the question of what exactly Hawk had been planning in New York at the moment of his arrest. We have mentioned the arsenic in the fountain pen. We have mentioned that he had proposed to the boarding house owner within 24 hours of arrival. But let us sit with those two facts together for a moment, because together they tell a specific story that is worth understanding clearly. He arrived in New York as a fugitive. He had fled Chicago with the knowledge that the police were looking for him, that his photograph was being circulated, that the exhumation of Marie Walker's body had produced evidence that connected him definitively to her death. He was a wanted man. Any rational fugitive, any person primarily concerned with their own safety, would have gone deep, would have found the most anonymous possible existence, avoided any contact that could lead to identification, survived on the minimum possible interaction with other people until it became safe to move again. Instead, within 24 hours of arriving in New York, he found a widow and began the process of marrying her. This tells you something. Not about recklessness exactly, though there is an element of that in it. It tells you something about the compulsive quality of what he did, about the degree to which the pattern of finding a widow, charming a widow, marrying a widow, had become so deeply embedded in his psychology and his operations that he could not, even in the most adverse circumstances, simply not do it. Even when the rational calculus was overwhelmingly against it, when every consideration of self-preservation argued for stillness and invisibility, he did it anyway. He needed the money, certainly. A man on the run needs resources. But he had resources, or at least the remains of what he had taken from Mrs. Fisher in Chicago. The financial necessity was real, but probably not so acute that it required action within 24 hours of arriving in a new city. What drove that speed, that immediate and reflexive orientation toward finding a new target, was something beyond simple financial calculation. It was the pattern itself, the compulsion of it, the thing he had done so many times in so many cities that it had become the shape of his existence, the thing he returned to the way a person might return to a particular habit, not because it always serves them well, but because it is the most familiar expression of who they are. This quality of behavioral compulsion is something that investigators and psychologists who study serial offenders have written about extensively. The compulsion to repeat, to return to the same pattern regardless of risk, to find the act of doing the thing more organizing than any competing consideration including safety, is one of the defining features of a certain type of criminal psychology. It is part of what makes serial offenders catchable, in the end, because the pattern is both necessary and revealing. They cannot stop doing the thing. And the thing, repeated, creates a trail. Hawk created a trail. And the trail led the New York police directly to him, to the boarding house, to the widow he was already charming, to the fountain pen with its cargo of arsenic waiting for the moment it would be needed. When he was arrested, when the handcuffs were on him and the officers were searching his belongings and the landlady was standing at the edge of the room with the specific quality of horror that comes from understanding what you have narrowly escaped, Johann Hawk's first concern appears to have been managing the situation. He was calm. He was cooperative. He answered the officers' questions in a manner that was neither aggressive nor excessively forthcoming. The careful, measured cooperation of a man who understood that the next hours would determine how this unfolded and who had decided that composure was his most useful tool. When they found the arsenic in the pen, he offered explanations. They tried tooth powder first, which the officers did not believe for a moment. Then they tried suicide, the claim that he had been contemplating ending his own life and had carried the arsenic for that purpose. This explanation had a certain surface plausibility, a certain sad logic, the fugitive who knows he is cornered and has been carrying an escape route with him. But the quantity, 58 grains, was hard to square with this narrative. A man contemplating self-poisoning does not need 58 grains. 7.5 grains would have been sufficient for that purpose, as the death of Marie Walker had demonstrated. 58 grains was a supply. It was a reserve. It was the working inventory of someone who expected to continue doing the thing that required arsenic, not once more, but multiple times more, across an undetermined future of marriages and extractions and convenient illnesses that the local doctor would call kidney disease. When the store that Hawk claimed to have purchased the arsenic from denied having sold it to him, the last of his alternative explanations collapsed. The arsenic was what it looked like. He had been carrying it for what it was used for. And he had been, at the moment of his arrest, in the process of initiating the next courtship. The boarding house owner whose proposal he had made spent the days following the arrest in a state that observers described as combining profound relief with something harder to name, something close to a sustained and rattling disorientation. Because here is the thing that the histories of these cases rarely fully convey. The women who escaped him, who were saved by their berthas or by a police bulletin or by sheer luck or timing, did not simply return to normal after the danger passed. The experience of having almost trusted the wrong person, of having allowed yourself to feel something for someone who turned out to be empty of anything real, leaves a mark. It changes something in the way you understand your own judgment. It makes you uncertain about yourself in a way that is both painful and persistent. The boarding house owner had not been charmed by Johann Hawk for very long. 24 hours. She had not sold her shop or handed over her savings or made the kind of deep investment that Marie Walker had made. She had barely begun the process. And yet the near miss, the recognition that she had been selected and was being processed through the beginning stages of a system designed to end in her death, was genuinely difficult to absorb and process. We do not have a lot of detail about what the weeks and months following the arrest were like for her, in part because the newspapers that covered the case were focused primarily on Hawk himself, on the trial and the multiple wives and the dramatic testimony and the verdict. The boarding house owner, whose name appears only fleetingly in the available accounts, was a secondary figure in the newspaper narrative, a supporting character in the story of Johann Hawk rather than the protagonist of her own experience, which, of course, she was. This is consistent with the broader problem we have been identifying throughout this telling. The women, even those who escaped, even those who acted with courage or who were saved by luck, were consistently written out of the center of the story by the gravitational pull of the central dramatic figure. He was simply more legible as a story. He fit the narrative templates of the era's crime journalism in ways that the women whose lives he affected did not. But she was there. In that boarding house in New York, a woman who had been lonely enough to respond quickly to warmth and attention, who had allowed a stranger's proposal to seem like something worth considering, who had narrowly missed becoming the next entry in the catalog of Johann Hawk's crimes. She was there, and the rest of her life unfolded from that near miss, shaped by it in ways that she may not have fully articulated even to herself, but that were nonetheless real and present and permanent. We do not know her name. We know she existed. We know she was saved, in large part, by the bravery of a German immigrant woman named Bertha Sohn who had the courage to accuse the man who had killed her sister and would not be talked out of it. There is a thread that runs from Bertha's courage to the boarding house owner's survival, a thread that stretches across 2 cities and several weeks, connecting through the specific mechanism of a police bulletin and a newspaper photograph and the diligent attention of New York City police officers who recognized a face. Threads like that are easy to miss. They do not announce themselves. They require you to look backward along the line of events to see how they connect, how the action taken at one point ripples forward to produce consequences at another point that the person who took the action could not have predicted or planned. Bertha Sohn did not know there was a boarding house owner in New York when she began making her accusations. She knew only that her sister was dead and that the man who had killed her was walking around free. She spoke because she could not do anything else. And the ripple of that speaking traveled farther than she knew. This is the way justice sometimes works. Not always as a clean and conclusive arc. Not always as the direct line between crime and consequence that courtroom dramas suggest, but as the accumulated effect of many individual acts of witness, many individual decisions to speak rather than stay silent, many individual refusals to let a wrong pass unnamed simply because naming it is difficult or costly or uncertain to produce any result. Bertha Sohn's refusal to let it pass. That is the turning point in this entire story. Everything else, the exhumation, the arsenic evidence, the bulletin, the arrest, the trial, The verdict, the execution, everything flows from the fact that one woman, grieving her sister and certain of what she had observed, would not be quiet about it. Let that rest with you for a moment. In the dark, in the quiet, in the private space of your own thinking, the woman who would not be quiet, who perhaps could not be quiet, because the alternative, silence in the face of something that wrong, was not a thing she was capable of choosing. Bertha Sohn. Remember her name. You can close your eyes now if you want to. The story is not over, but it is not going anywhere. It will be here when you wake. And if you drift off now with the image of Bertha Sohn in your mind, the image of a woman who spoke when it mattered and changed the outcome of a story that might otherwise have ended very differently, that is not the worst thing to carry into sleep. Rest. We will continue when you are ready. Let us talk now about the interrogation room. Because in this story, which has many arresting and difficult moments, the scene in the interrogation room is one that stands apart in the historical record for a quality that is both painful and, in its own way, cathartic. It happened in Chicago after Hawk was extradited from New York, after he had been formally charged, after the apparatus of the legal process had been set in motion. The police, in building their case, had been reaching out to women who had been connected to Hawk, under his various aliases, in various cities, and several of these women had been brought to Chicago to assist with the investigation and to provide testimony. 5 of them were present in the interrogation room when Johann Hawk was brought in. 5 women who had married him, or had been in the process of marrying him, or had been in his orbit in some intimate capacity. 5 women who had experienced varying versions of the same story, the same warm approach, the same confident lies, the same extraction of money, the same eventual abandonment, or worse. 5 women who had never met each other before that room because they had each existed in their own separate city and their own separate story, none of them knowing about the others, all of them carrying what had happened to them in the privacy of whatever understanding they had been able to construct about it. And now they were in the same room, and they could see each other. The accounts of what happened in that room describe a scene of considerable emotional intensity. These were not women who had been invited to some kind of official victim support gathering. They were there primarily to make formal identification, to confirm that this was the man they had known as John Schmidt or Henry Bartels or Jacob Huff, or whatever name he had used with each of them. The official purpose was procedural, but the human reality of the situation was anything but. When you put 5 women in a room together who have lived through the same experience, albeit in their own individual forms of it, something happens. The private shame, the private self-questioning, the sense of having been uniquely foolish or uniquely unlucky that each of them had probably been carrying alone, begins to dissolve. Because if 5 women were deceived by the same man, the problem is not the women. The problem is the man. The intelligence of the deception is not an indictment of the intelligence of the deceived. It is an indictment of the deceiver. And seeing that truth reflected in 4 other faces, for other sets of eyes that carry the same specific knowledge, can be both devastating and clarifying. The women, according to contemporary accounts, were visibly distressed. Some wept. Some were angry. The anger, in particular, seems to have been the dominant emotional register for several of them. A hot and righteous anger that had nowhere adequate to go, but that the presence of the other women somehow validated and amplified. They had all been made fools of. They had all been robbed, whether of their money or their dignity or their belief in their own capacity to read a person accurately. And now they were in a room together, and they could see each other's faces, and they knew. When Hawk was brought in, the reaction was immediate. Several women began speaking at once. The officers present, by various accounts, had some difficulty managing the room. The women were not violent, but they were vociferous in a way that did not care much about procedural decorum. They wanted to be heard. They wanted him to hear them. They wanted, if nothing else, the experience of saying out loud to his face what he had done to them, what it had cost them, what the consequences of his particular calculations had been in their specific and individual lives. Hawk, brought into this room of grief and outrage, showed them what he always showed everyone: the equanimity, the mild composure, the eyes that were present in the room but not actually moved by it. He looked at these women with the same expression he had apparently worn throughout his interrogations and his jail interviews, the expression of a man tracking a situation that affected him practically but not emotionally. He acknowledged them. He did not deny knowing them. He did not rage or weep or make any outward show of the confrontation affecting him in the register of feeling. This, for some of the women, was perhaps the worst of it. Not his presence in the room, not even the confirmation of what they had suspected about him, but the confirmation that the warmth they had experienced from him, the attentiveness and the apparent feeling, had been entirely manufactured, and that the manufacturer was not even capable of being disturbed by the confrontation with its consequences. He was genuinely not there. Behind the face, behind the composed and functional exterior, the thing they had believed they were in a relationship with had never existed. One of the women, according to a newspaper report of the time, said to him directly, "You are nothing but a machine." This may or may not be an exact quote. The newspaper accounts of the era were not always rigorous about distinguishing direct quotation from paraphrase or editorial interpretation. But whether or not those were her exact words, they capture something real about the experience of being in that room and looking at that face and understanding, with the full force of an irreversible clarity, that there had never been anything on the other side of the feelings you had had for him. A machine. It is a striking image and perhaps an imprecise one, since machines are neutral in a way that Johann Hock was not. He had made choices. He had deliberately constructed the warmth and attention he used to attract these women. He had deliberately selected them and deliberately deceived them, and in at least one case, and probably more, had deliberately poisoned them. These are not the actions of a machine. They are the actions of a person who has fully and consciously chosen to treat other people as means rather than ends, who has arrived at a moral position of such thoroughgoing contempt for human life that the deaths of the people he lived with can be planned and executed with no more internal resistance than any other practical problem. But the woman who said it was not wrong about the specific quality of blankness she encountered, that blankness was real. Whatever the mechanism that produced it, whatever the combination of constitutional traits and developmental history and conscious choices that had assembled this particular human being in this particular form, the result was a person who could be in a room full of women whose lives he had damaged or ended and feel nothing, show nothing, give them nothing. Not remorse, not recognition, not even the satisfaction of visible guilt, which is at least an acknowledgement that the wrong done matters. Nothing. This is, in its way, a harder thing to process than the more recognizable expressions of cruelty. We have cultural templates for the monster who knows he is a monster, who gloats or rages or trembles. We do not have very good templates for the person who simply is not there in the way a person is supposed to be there. The emptiness is not dramatic. It does not give you anything to hold on to. It just is. And the women in that room had to hold on to it anyway. Had to take what they found in his face back out into their lives and integrate it into their understanding of what had happened to them. Had to explain it to themselves in some way that allowed them to go on. This is the work that survivors of intimate betrayal do, work that is rarely visible and rarely honored, and that takes, for many people, years. The work of reconstituting a sense of your own judgment when that judgment has been comprehensively violated by someone who had every interest in making it easier to violate. The work of separating the fact of having been deceived from the story that says being deceived means something is wrong with you. The work of living, after something like this, as a full and trusting person rather than someone who has learned that trust itself is dangerous. Some of them did this work. Some of them did not, or could not, or did it only partially. We do not have good records of the lives of these women after the trial. They disappear from the newspaper accounts, which had been about Johann Hock all along rather than about them. They return to wherever they lived, and they carry with them what they carry, and the world moves forward without particular concern for what their days look like now. But we can sit with them for a moment here, in the way this kind of story allows you to do when you approach it slowly and with care. 5 women in a room, each of them carrying her own version of the same story, each of them having survived, in one way or another, the specific damage of having trusted a man who had never merited trust, and who had used that trust to take from them, and, in some cases, to take everything. They survived. That is not nothing. They were in that room, and they were alive, and they were furious, and they were seen. Whatever happened after, the fact of that room, the fact of their presence in it, the fact that they were there to be witnesses and to name what had been done to them, is worth honoring. The trial itself, which formally opened in the spring of 1905, was in some ways a more orderly and less emotionally transparent event than the interrogation room had been. Courtrooms enforce a particular kind of structure, a particular rhythm of testimony and response and objection and ruling, that channels emotion into forms that the legal process can accommodate. Witnesses are sworn in and questioned and cross-examined. Evidence is presented and challenged. Arguments are made and countered. The whole proceeding moves forward with the deliberate pacing of a formal inquiry rather than the raw and immediate quality of 5 women recognizing the man who had hurt them. For the prosecution, the case was built carefully around the strongest available evidence. The arsenic in Marie Walker's body was the centerpiece. Dr. Walter Haynes, a toxicologist called to testify, presented his findings from the analysis of the stomach contents with the methodical clarity of a professional scientist whose work will be challenged and who wants it to be as bulletproof as possible. The quantity of arsenic, the distribution of it within the body, the absence of arsenic in the prescribed medicine, in the embalming fluid, in any source that might explain its presence as accidental or incidental. The analysis was clear and specific, and it pointed in one direction. The symptoms of Marie's final illness were presented through the testimony of Dr. John Reese, who had attended her, and who acknowledged now, with the discomfort of a professional whose diagnostic error had contributed to a missed opportunity to intervene, that the symptoms he had treated as kidney disease were fully consistent with arsenic poisoning, and that had he considered that possibility and acted on it, the outcome might have been different. This testimony was difficult for him to give. You can hear, in the formal language of the courtroom record, the weight of a man acknowledging that the thing he had diagnosed incorrectly had turned out to be murder, and that his misdiagnosis had, in effect, allowed the murder to proceed without interruption. The pattern evidence was presented through testimony from several of Hawk's former wives and associates, women who described with varying degrees of detail and emotional distance the same basic sequence: the swift courtship, the financial manipulation, the illness or abandonment, the departure. None of these women had been poisoned, or none had been poisoned in the way Marie had been poisoned, but their testimony built the picture of a systematic operator, a man who had done this many times before in a recognizable and consistent pattern. Hawk's attorney did his best with the available material. He challenged the chain of custody of the toxicological samples. He questioned whether the arsenic could have been introduced into the body after death, through the embalming process or through other means. He pointed to the diagnosis of Bright's disease and argued that it represented a legitimate medical interpretation that was still possible. He suggested that the pattern evidence was circumstantial and that its admission was unfair in a case where the charge was murder of a single specific individual. These were not unreasonable legal arguments. They were the kinds of arguments that defense attorneys are supposed to make, the adversarial testing of the prosecution's case that is the cornerstone of the justice system. But the jury, having heard all of it, having sat with the full weight of the evidence and the testimony for the duration of the trial, concluded what the evidence supported: guilty. On May 19, 1905, the verdict was appealed. The appeal was heard by the Illinois Supreme Court. The court reviewed the procedural record and the evidence, and found no sufficient grounds to overturn the conviction. The verdict stood. The death sentence stood. Throughout the appeals process, Hawk continued to give interviews and to correspond with people outside the jail. He remained, to the end, the same composed and mildly communicative presence he had always been. He said, in one interview that was widely reprinted, that he bore no ill will toward anyone involved in the proceedings against him. He said this with the same flat sincerity that he had always deployed when sincerity was useful. What he meant by it, or whether he was capable of meaning anything in the register that the phrase implies, is difficult to say. He was asked, in those final weeks, about the other women. The investigators and the newspaper reporters who had access to him before the execution tried, with varying degrees of directness, to get him to speak about the women whose deaths had not been formally charged, to provide some accounting of the full scope of what he had done. He deflected these questions with practiced ease, neither confirming nor denying, offering nothing that could be used to either expand the charges or to provide closure to whatever families might be searching for it. This was, in its own way, a final act of control. He had spent his entire criminal career as a man who controlled the information about himself, who decided what other people knew and believed and felt about him. He maintained that control to the end. He would not give investigators what they wanted. He would not give the families of the potentially unnamed victims what they needed. He would close this chapter of his story the way he had managed all the others, on his own terms, taking the full accounting with him rather than releasing it to the world. And so on February 23, 1906, Johann Hock was executed in Chicago. He was 45 years old, though the record is not entirely certain even about this, given the number of identities he had assumed and the incomplete nature of the documentation around his early life. He went to the execution with the composure that had characterized everything. No last-minute confession. No naming of names. No acknowledgement of the full weight of what his choices had cost the people around him. He simply ceased. And the silence he left behind was the final version of the silence he had always maintained. The silence where remorse and accountability and the full human reckoning with consequence should have been. That silence is still there. It is not comfortable to sit with, but it is honest. It tells you something true about the nature of what Johann Hock was, more truly than any confession could have, because a confession could have been performed the way everything else about him was performed. The silence, that final and absolute silence, is the one thing he could not manage. The one thing that showed, in relief, the absence at the center of him. Let it settle. Let the night hold it for you. You are still here. You are still listening, or perhaps you have drifted, which is also fine, which is also beautiful. The story has done what stories like this do, which is to carry a piece of the truth about what happened to people who deserved better across the years, to someone who was willing to receive it and sit with it and not look away. That is the work of witnessing. You have done it tonight. Rest now. If you are still awake, still listening in the velvet dark of wherever you are, there is one more layer of this story that deserves to be explored. Not the mechanics of what Hock did. We have lived with those in some detail now, and the picture they form is complete enough. But the aftermath, the legacy, what the case of Johann Hock tells us about the specific historical moment in which it occurred, and what it continues to tell us about the systems and the social conditions that allowed it to unfold the way it did. But first, let us turn back to one of the quieter human details in this story. Let us talk about the specific morning when Marie Walker first read the advertisement in the Abend Post. Because this moment, ordinary in its externals, a woman sitting with a newspaper, perhaps with a cup of coffee on the table beside her, and the sound of her candy shop settling around her in the early hours before the first customers came, is the actual pivot point of everything that followed. It is the moment where possibility opened and where, had the world been arranged differently, the story might have had a different shape. She was in her 40s. She had been married before, and that marriage had ended. The specific circumstances of its end are not fully preserved in the historical record, but the word divorced appears in some accounts, which in the early 1900s carried its own particular weight. Divorce was not impossible in that era, but it was still uncommon enough to carry a social stigma, particularly for a woman. Marie had navigated whatever that social reality meant for someone in her position and had built her life forward anyway, which was its own form of resilience. The candy store on Willow Street was hers. She had made it work. She knew her customers. She kept good hours. She had her sister Bertha nearby, and the small, dense world of community around her. The German immigrant neighborhood of Chicago in those years was a specific and warm and somewhat self-contained universe, and Marie was embedded in it in the ways that mattered. But she was alone at the center of her life in a way that the store and the community could not fully address. The particular aloneness that comes from not having someone to come home to, someone to tell the small frustrations of the day to, someone to sit quietly with in the evenings when the work was done. These are not dramatic needs. They are some of the most fundamental of human needs, so fundamental that their absence can be almost harder to name than their presence, because when they are absent you do not always have the language for what is missing, only the awareness of an absence that shapes the texture of your days. She read the advertisement. She considered it. She wrote a response. This decision, this simple act of writing a letter to an address given in a German-language newspaper advertisement, has been treated in some historical accounts as a kind of naivete, an error of judgment that a more sophisticated or cautious woman would not have made. This reading is wrong, and it is worth saying so clearly. Responding to a matrimonial advertisement in a community newspaper was not a naive act in the early 1900s. It was a perfectly reasonable and relatively common way to meet someone when you were an immigrant widow in a city where your social network was limited by language and community and the specific constraints of your daily life. It was the tool available. She used it. The naivete, if there was any, was not hers. The naivete, if we are going to put that word anywhere in this story, belongs to the broader social system that had not yet developed the mechanisms to protect people who were doing entirely reasonable things from the predators who had learned to exploit those reasonable things as access points. There was no background check. There was no centralized record of marriages that could be cross-referenced against his aliases. There was no database of suspicious deaths across multiple jurisdictions. There was no institutional memory that connected John Schmidt in Milwaukee to Henry Bartels in Cincinnati to Johann Hawk in Chicago. There was only the advertisement and the letter and the meeting and the decision, made in good faith, to trust. She trusted, and the trust was destroyed. And the destruction of it, and her death, and Bertha's grief, and the investigation, and the trial, and all of it flows from the fact that the systems that were supposed to make trust safe were not adequate to the threat that Johann Hawk represented. This is important to understand because it shifts the moral weight of the story to where it belongs. Not on Marie Walker for responding to an advertisement. Not on the women who married him and handed over their savings and believed his lies, because believing lies that are told with sufficient skill is not a character defect. It is a human condition. It is what happens when a person with the specific psychological construction of Johann Hawk, the total absence of genuine feeling combined with the complete capacity to simulate it, is given access to people who have the full human experience of real feeling and who therefore expect that expression of feeling in another person corresponds to feeling that is actually there. The moral weight belongs on him. And it belongs on the structures that made him possible. The structures of record-keeping that were too fragmented to connect his trail. The structures of medical practice that were too limited to reliably detect arsenic poisoning when it presented as kidney disease. The structures of social expectation that made the deaths of immigrant widows easy to attribute to natural causes without asking harder questions. The structures of gender and age and social position that made middle-aged immigrant women the specific kind of invisible that allowed their suffering to pass largely unremarked. All of these structures, he did not create them. They existed before him, and they continued to exist after him, though some of them were modified in response to his case. What he did was exploit them with a thoroughness and a duration that made the exploitation visible in a way that ordinary exploitation often is not. The modifications that followed, the slow, gradual improvements in forensic chemistry and interstate communication and the basic procedures around suspicious deaths, were real, if partial and slow. The Hawk case and others like it contributed to the growing awareness, in medical and legal communities, that arsenic poisoning needed to be considered more routinely in unexplained deaths, that the symptoms of arsenic poisoning needed to be better understood by practicing physicians, that the chemical tests for arsenic needed to be more widely available and more routinely employed. These changes did not happen immediately or completely. They happened over decades, through the accumulated pressure of many cases and many advocates and many professional organizations arguing for better practices. But the Hawk case was one of the data points in that accumulation, one of the instances where the cost of not having better systems was made visible and undeniable and documented in a way that persisted in the record. This is the way that social change often works in the wake of terrible things. Not through dramatic overnight transformation, but through the slow accumulation of evidence that something needs to change, and the slow building of professional and institutional will to actually change it. The evidence came, in part, from the graves of women who had died because the systems were not adequate. The will came, in part, from the people who stood over those graves and understood that the inadequacy was not acceptable. Now let us turn, for a moment, to something that requires some care to discuss, which is the psychological dimension of what Johann Hawk was. Because the question of what a person like this is, what internal reality corresponds to the external behavior we have been describing, is one that matters not just academically but practically, in terms of how we understand the world and protect each other in it. The vocabulary of the early 20th century did not have the diagnostic precision to characterize Hawk in the terms that a later century psychology would apply. The word psychopath had not yet taken on its modern clinical meaning. The concept of antisocial personality disorder did not exist in codified form. The specific cluster of traits that clinicians today associate with what is sometimes called the psychopathic spectrum, the absence of empathy, the superficial charm, the instrumental use of relationships, the absence of guilt, the consistent exploitation of others for personal gain, these were recognized in their individual manifestations but not yet organized into a coherent diagnostic framework. What the people who dealt with Hawk had was observation. They watched him. They talked to him. They compared notes with each other about what they found. And what they consistently described, across multiple accounts and contexts, was exactly what we would now associate with the classic clinical presentation of psychopathic traits. The charm without warmth. The intelligence without conscience. The complete and apparently genuine absence of any internal register of guilt or remorse or the weight of consequence. This does not mean that Hawk could not have stopped himself. The legal and moral determination that he was responsible for his actions was correct. Whatever his psychological constitution, he made choices. He chose the women he chose. He placed the advertisements. He used the arsenic. He ran when the running was still possible. These are not the actions of someone who has lost their capacity for choice. They are the actions of someone who chose consistently and deliberately and with full awareness of what they were doing. The psychological framework matters not for the question of his responsibility, which is clear, but for the question of how people like him exist in the world and how they can be recognized and stopped before the count of victims grows as high as his did. Because if we understand the specific characteristics of predatory behavior, the particular combination of superficial warmth and strategic selection of vulnerable targets and systematic exploitation of trust, we become better equipped to see it when it appears. Not perfectly equipped, not immune to being deceived, but better equipped than we were without the understanding. And that is worth something. That is worth a great deal. There is a man in this story who did something important that also deserves recognition, and who does not appear often enough in the accounts of the case. This is George Shippey, the Chicago chief of police, who was at the center of the investigation in those early weeks of 1905. Shippey oversaw the decision to pursue the exhumation of Marie Walker's body, which was not an automatic or obvious choice in that era. Exhumation required official authorization and involved legal and logistical complexities that made it a step that many police departments of the time would have been reluctant to take on the basis of a grieving sister's accusation alone. Shippey authorized it. He took Bertha Sohn's accusations seriously in a professional culture that was not always inclined to take the accusations of immigrant women seriously. He moved quickly enough that the investigation got ahead of Hawk before Hawk had time to fully establish himself under his next alias and disappear again. Whether this was the result of particular moral clarity on Shippey's part, or simply the professional instinct of a good investigator who recognized the pattern for what it was, is difficult to say. But the decision was made and acted on, and the case was built, and the bulletin was issued, and Johann Hawk was stopped. Shippey, like Bertha, deserves his place in this story as someone whose actions at a critical moment determined how the story ended. Without the exhumation, without the arsenic evidence it produced, the case against Hawk would have been circumstantial to a degree that might not have sustained a capital conviction. Without the bulletin, Hawk might have established himself in New York with sufficient stability that his arrest would have been much more difficult or much more delayed. Without the quickness and the decisiveness of the investigation, more women might have died. These things matter. The people who did them matter. And they are part of the story of this case that the newspaper narratives, focused on the dramatic figure of the murderer himself, tended to compress. If you are still listening, if the night has stayed with you and the story has kept you company through its difficult parts and its quieter parts, I want you to know that you have done something genuine tonight by staying with it. You have let this story, these people, this specific moment in history matter to you. That kind of witness, the willingness to receive something difficult and sit with it without looking away, is not common. It is a form of honoring. And these people, Marie and Bertha, and the women whose names we do not know, deserve to be honored. Let yourself rest now. The story continues, but the night is getting deeper and the warm dark around you is doing what it does best, which is holding you gently and asking nothing of you. You have done the work tonight. Let sleep do the rest. There is a particular dimension of the Johann Hawk case that has not received as much attention as it deserves, and that is the question of what his victims understood or rather, what they were able to understand, given the limitations of what was knowable in that era about the mechanisms of intimate predation. Because understanding and the absence of understanding matter here in ways that go beyond the individual case and into questions about how we teach each other to protect ourselves, and about the limits of protection when a skilled enough predator is involved. Marie Walker, in those final weeks of her life, experiencing the symptoms that we now recognize as arsenic poisoning, but that she had been told to understand as kidney disease, did not know what was happening to her. This is not a small thing. The experience of dying, for most people, is partly organized by the explanatory framework you have access to. When you understand what is happening to your body, when the doctor has given you a name for it, and a treatment plan and a rough sense of how things might progress, you have, even in the worst circumstances, something to hold on to. The knowledge itself is a form of agency. You can make decisions based on it. You can say goodbye in an informed way. You can assign meaning to what is happening. Marie had none of this. She had a wrong diagnosis and the attendant confusion that comes from experiencing a body in serious distress, whose distress you cannot accurately interpret. She was thirsty in a way that nothing satisfied, and presumably the doctor's explanation for this did not fully account for why nothing satisfied it. She had pain that came in waves and nausea that offered no relief, and a burning sensation on her skin that was probably alarming and difficult to understand. She was experiencing, in other words, not just the physical suffering of being poisoned, but the cognitive and emotional disorientation of suffering that cannot be adequately explained. And throughout all of this, the man who had given her the arsenic was present in the house, was, by some accounts, attentive and concerned seeming, bringing her water that did not help, sitting with her during the difficult hours, performing the role of the worried husband with the same precision he had performed every other role. This adds a layer of cruelty that is difficult to fully process. She was being poisoned, and the person doing it was in the room with her, pretending to care about whether she lived. This proximity, this specific intimate cruelty of being poisoned by someone whose presence you associate with safety and care, is what made arsenic poisoning such an effective tool for domestic murder in that era and before it. The trust that domestic life requires, the vulnerability of being sick in your own home and needing someone to bring you things, the difficulty of imagining that the person who shares your bed and your table and your daily life is also the source of the thing that is killing you. These things are not weaknesses. They are the features of a functional relationship. They become vulnerabilities only when someone deliberately exploits them. Johann Hock exploited them with full knowledge of what he was doing. There is a phrase that appears in the criminological literature about cases like this, the phrase of the trusted intimate, and it captures something important about the specific nature of this kind of crime. Stranger violence, which occupies a much larger portion of our cultural imagination around danger, is a recognizable and external threat. We have frameworks for it. We know what it looks like in outline. We teach children to be wary of strangers. We have protocols for locking doors and walking with awareness in unfamiliar areas. The threat of the trusted intimate is fundamentally different because the protection against it requires abandoning the very trust that makes intimate life possible. And no society and no individual can sustain a permanent defensive posture against the people they live with. The cost of that would be the complete dissolution of the intimacy that makes human life worth living. So the women who trusted Johann Hock were not wrong to trust. They were responding normally to someone who was presenting himself as trustworthy. The failure was not theirs. And this is a truth that the society of their time was not fully equipped to articulate or act on, partly because the psychology and criminology of intimate predation was not yet developed, and partly because the dominant cultural narratives of that era tended to place significant responsibility on women for the things that happened to them in domestic contexts, as if the quality of their judgment in choosing men was what determined their safety rather than the honesty of the men they chose. This tendency to place responsibility on victims rather than perpetrators is something that has been identified and challenged in the century since Hock's case, though not as thoroughly as it needs to be challenged, and not with complete consistency. We still find it easier, in the face of intimate predation, to ask what the victim might have done differently than to ask what systems failed to protect them or what characteristics in the perpetrator allowed the predation to occur. The question of why she married him so quickly is easier to formulate than the question of why his behavior was not detected and stopped years earlier. But the second question is the more important one. The first question looks backward at what one woman could have done differently on one specific occasion. The second question looks at the full structure of the situation and asks what could be changed to prevent the situation from occurring at all, for all future women in similar circumstances. Johann Hoch's case produced some movement toward the second question. The forensic chemistry improvements, the improved interstate communication protocols, the greater awareness of arsenic poisoning in the medical community. These were changes directed at the structure rather than at the individual decisions of individual women. They were changes that acknowledged, at some institutional level, that the problem was not the women's judgment, but the inadequacy of the systems meant to protect them. There is also something worth saying about the role of the German-language press in this story, the specific role of the Abendpost, because it is somewhat complicated. The Abendpost ran the matrimonial advertisement that brought Hoch into contact with Marie Walker. It also, as part of the broader press coverage of the case, ran the stories that ultimately contributed to public awareness of what Hoch had done and to the circulation of his image that led to his arrest. The same institution that provided the access point for his predation also participated in the mechanism that stopped him. This is not unusual. Institutions that serve communities are frequently used both by the communities themselves and by those who wish to exploit those communities. The German-language press was not complicit in Johann Hoch's crimes in any meaningful sense. It was providing a service that most people who used it used honestly and for legitimate purposes. The fact that Hoch was able to use that service as a targeting mechanism says something about the service's limitations, about the absence of any vetting process for matrimonial advertisements. But this was a limitation that practically no one in that era recognized as a significant problem until Hoch's case made it visible. After the case, some German-language newspapers did implement informal screening procedures for matrimonial advertisements, checking the bona fides of people placing them to whatever degree was practicable. This was not a systemic solution, but it was a response. And it reflected the understanding, arrived at through the terrible specificity of what had happened, that the service they were providing could be used as a weapon and that they had some responsibility to make that harder. Now, there is one more thread in this story that we have mentioned but not fully pulled on, and it is worth pulling on now. The thread of the aliases. The thread of how a man becomes a different man in a new city and the implications of that transformation for the people around him. Johann Hoch had at least a dozen documented aliases over the course of his criminal career. John Schmidt, Henry Bartels, Jacob Huff, Martin Dotz. Johann Hoch was itself, for much of his life, one of several names in rotation. He used these names with discipline and consistency within each specific context, maintaining the alias long enough to accomplish whatever he had come to accomplish, and then setting it aside when the context required it. He had, in other words, a fully developed capacity for the management of multiple parallel identities, each of them coherent and internally consistent as long as they were operating in their designated space. None of them contaminated by contact with the others because the others did not exist in the same geographic space. This capacity for parallel identity management is not unique to criminal predators. It exists in many forms and for many reasons. People who live double lives for entirely benign reasons. People who maintain separate professional and personal identities with minimal overlap. People who present themselves differently in different contexts as a matter of social survival. Know something about the mechanics of what Hoch was doing without, of course, using those mechanics for anything like the purposes he used them for. The fundamental technique of maintaining separate presentations for separate audiences is part of the normal repertoire of social behavior. What was unusual about Hoch was the thoroughness and the consistency of the practice, the complete commitment to the alias while in it, and the ability to switch between them with apparent effortlessness. Most people find the maintenance of a consistent false identity cognitively demanding and emotionally costly. It requires constant vigilance, constant monitoring of what you have said to whom, constant management of the risk of contradiction. For Hoch, by all available evidence, this maintenance was not costly at all. He did it the way other people breathe, automatically, without apparent effort or strain. This, again, points toward the specific psychology we have been circling throughout this telling. The capacity for sustained deception without internal conflict requires, at a minimum, that the deception not feel wrong. And for that to be true, there has to be some component of the normal internal experience of wrongness that is simply not operative. Call it conscience, call it empathy, call it the imagination of what the experience is like on the other side of the deception. Whatever you call it, when it is present in sufficient strength, it makes sustained deception extremely difficult. When it is absent, or when it is present only as an occasional and easily overridden consideration rather than a persistent and organizing force, the deception is easy. It is just behavior. Hawk's aliases were just behavior. They were tools, maintained because they were useful, set aside when they were not. He did not agonize over them. He did not lie awake at night troubled by the multiplicity of identities he was sustaining. He simply used them, the way you would use any tool that works. And the women who believed in those identities, who trusted that the man calling himself John Schmidt or Henry Bartels was a coherent and knowable person with an interior life that corresponded to the exterior he presented, were trusting something that was not there. They were trusting the performance, not the performer. They were building a relationship with a construction, not a person. This is a horror that has a very specific character. Not the horror of a sudden violent act, which is terrible in one register, but the horror of discovering that something you believed was real was entirely fabricated, that the feeling of connection you had was entirely unreciprocated, that you were the only real thing in the relationship. All the feeling was on your side. All the investment of emotion and trust and hope was on your side. He brought nothing to it but calculation. If you have ever trusted someone completely and been wrong about them in a significant way, you know something of the specific quality of this discovery. Not the same magnitude, almost certainly, but the same basic shape. The retroactive hollowing of something you thought was solid. The backward reinterpretation of memories that feel different now because you understand them differently now. The confusion between the person you thought they were and the person they actually were, and the difficulty of resolving that confusion in a way that allows you to go forward without carrying the whole weight of it. This is what the women who survived Johann Hawk were left with. That retroactive hollowing. That reinterpretation, that confusion, carried, each of them, privately, in cities scattered across the Midwest and perhaps beyond, without a language for it that other people would readily understand, without the support structures that a later century would develop for exactly these experiences. They were resilient, those women. They had to be, simply to survive the circumstances they had navigated before they ever met Johann Hawk. They were immigrant women who had crossed an ocean and built lives in a new country and outlasted whatever had ended their first marriages and continued forward anyway. They had the specific resilience of people who have already demonstrated their capacity for recovery, and they would need all of it for what came after. We do not know, for most of them, what after looked like. The historical record closes around them quickly and does not reopen. They return to their anonymous lives, and the record moves on to other things. But they were there. They continued. And that continuation, that persistence in the face of what had been done to them, is its own form of dignity. If you are still listening, still here with this story in the gentle dark, I want you to hold that thought for a moment. The dignity of continuation. The particular form of courage that is not dramatic, that does not announce itself, that is simply the act of getting up the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, building a life forward from whatever has damaged it, refusing to be defined entirely by the damage. That is what these women did. That is what Bertha Sohn did. After burying her sister, and watching the man who killed her be brought to justice, and then returning to her own life, and her own days, and whatever it looked like to be herself in the world without Marie in it. Breathe. Settle. The night is deep now, and the story is settling into its final movements. Not the ending yet, but close enough to feel the movement of the current changing direction. Let yourself rest into that change. You are safe. The night is good. The year 1905 was, in many ways, a watershed moment for American crime and criminology. Not solely because of Johann Hawk, though his case was certainly part of it, but because of a confluence of circumstances and cases and developing professional disciplines that were beginning to fundamentally reshape how law enforcement and the medical establishment understood and responded to criminal behavior. The science of forensic medicine was changing. The analytical chemistry techniques that allowed a skilled toxicologist to identify and quantify arsenic in human tissue were becoming more standardized and more widely available. The development of the Marsh test and its refinements had made arsenic detection significantly more reliable than it had been just a generation earlier, though the application of those techniques was still uneven, still dependent on individual physicians knowing to ask for them and individual laboratories having the equipment and expertise to conduct them. The Hawk case made a contribution to this process of standardization. The clarity and completeness of the toxicological analysis in the Marie Walker case, and the extensive coverage that analysis received in the press and in professional medical and legal publications, helped establish a precedent for what thorough forensic investigation of a suspicious death should look like. It became a case study. It was discussed in medical schools and in the professional literature. The specific detail that arsenic was found in the stomach, but not in the medicine or the embalming fluid, was used as an example of the importance of systematic investigation rather than reliance on presumptive diagnosis. This is how cases become part of the evolution of practice, not through single dramatic transformations, but through their entry into the teaching record, their use as examples in training and education and professional discussion, their gradual normalization of a higher standard of inquiry. And the Hawk case was well suited to serve this function because it was, in its essentials, clear. The arsenic was there. The source of the arsenic was identifiable. The timeline of the illness corresponded precisely to the known progression of arsenic poisoning. The absence of legitimate explanatory sources for the arsenic was documentable. These were the features of a case that could be taught, because they illustrated the relevant principles with uncommon clarity. But there is something else about the year 1905 that is worth noting, something that seems unrelated on its surface but that connects to the Johann Hawk case in a way that is illuminating. And that is the beginning of the long national conversation about the rights and protections of women, a conversation that was gathering force in that era and that would, over the following decades, produce a series of transformations in law and social practice that progressively improved the protections available to women in the specific kinds of situations that had made Hawk's victims so vulnerable. The suffrage movement, which in 1905 was not yet close to its goal of voting rights, but was building the infrastructure of argument and organization that would eventually get there, was part of a broader cultural reckoning with the position of women in American society. This reckoning included questions about economic independence, about property rights in marriage, about the legal standing of women in divorce and in courts, about the social norms that made certain kinds of exploitation of women simultaneously common and unremarkable. The Johann Hawk case touched many of these issues. It made visible, in a very specific and concrete way, the economic vulnerability of widowed women, the way that their need for security and their limited access to financial systems on their own terms made them attractive targets for exactly the kind of scheme Hawk had run. It made visible the degree to which the law and the medical establishment had, up to that point, been inadequate to the specific threats that this vulnerability exposed women to. And it made visible the human cost of these inadequacies in a way that the abstract discussion of women's rights could not always achieve, because the cost was specific and named and documented. This is not to suggest that the Hawk case caused any particular reform in isolation. Social change is not that simple, but it was part of the accumulating evidence, the accumulating record of cost and consequence, that made the arguments for change impossible to dismiss as purely theoretical. Now, let us spend a little time with the medical dimension of this case, because it is both interesting in its own right and important for understanding the full scope of what allowed Hawk to operate. The story of arsenic as a poison is, in some ways, a story that runs parallel to the history of forensic medicine itself, because the development of reliable detection techniques for arsenic was one of the primary drivers of the development of forensic toxicology as a discipline. Arsenic had been used as a poison in Europe and elsewhere for centuries before Johann Hawk discovered its utility. Its popularity with domestic murderers, and with the specific subset of domestic murderers who wanted to kill quietly and blame natural causes, derived from several practical properties. It was, as we have noted, available. It was cheap. It was, when administered in the right quantities, slow enough in its action to allow the murder to be completed under the cover of apparent illness rather than sudden death. And until the early 19th century, it was essentially undetectable after the fact. A body exhumed weeks or months after death showed no reliable chemical signature of arsenic that the analytical techniques of the time could identify. This meant that a murderer who had used arsenic and gotten the body quickly into the ground had, in practical terms, a very good chance of escaping any forensic consequence for the murder. The symptoms had been attributed to illness. The doctor had signed a certificate. The case was closed. The development of the Marsh test in 1836 changed this. James Marsh, a British chemist, developed a procedure that could reliably detect arsenic in biological tissue in quantities as small as a fraction of a grain, which was well below the lethal dose. The test was not immediately perfect or immediately universally adopted, but it represented a fundamental shift in the forensic landscape. For the first time, it was possible to look at a body, even months after death, and determine with chemical certainty whether arsenic was present and in what quantity. This change rippled through the courts. In the decades following the development of the Marsh test, there were a series of high-profile trials in England and America in which the test was used as the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, in which bodies were exhumed and tested, and the presence of arsenic was used as the basis for murder convictions. These cases helped establish the precedent and the procedure. They trained judges and juries and attorneys in the nature and reliability of forensic toxicological evidence. They normalized the idea that chemistry could speak where other evidence was silent. By the time Johann Hock poisoned Marie Walker, the Marsh test and its successors had been in use for nearly 70 years. The technique was well established in principle. The problem, in the Walker case as in many cases before it, was not the availability of the test but the decision to employ it. Because the test can only tell you what is there if someone decides to look. And someone will only decide to look if someone has reason to suspect that there is something to find. Marie Walker's doctor did not suspect arsenic. He diagnosed kidney disease and treated kidney disease and did not consider, as he was leaving the sick room, that what he had just observed might be something else entirely. This was not negligence in any simple sense. It was the result of a diagnostic framework that did not include arsenic poisoning as a routine possibility in a case presenting with these symptoms in this context. Married woman, recent marriage, domestic setting, German immigrant community. Nothing in the surface features of the situation that announced itself as suspicious in the way that might trigger a more searching investigation. Bertha Sohn's accusations changed that. They introduced, for the first time in this particular case, the possibility that the illness had not been natural. And that possibility, once introduced, created the warrant for the exhumation and the testing that ultimately produced the evidence the case was built on. This is why the case makes Bertha so central. She was not just the person who spoke when others stayed silent. She was the person who introduced the possibility of a different interpretation. She said, "This might not be what it looks like." She said, "Look again." And the look that followed found what she had been saying was there. In the language of investigation, she was the source of the investigative hypothesis that led to the evidence. Without the hypothesis, the evidence would never have been sought. The Marsh test would never have been applied. The arsenic would have remained in the body undiscovered, and Marie Walker's death certificate would have continued to read kidney disease, and Johann Hock would have moved on to the next city with the fountain pen full of arsenic and the warm German accent and the confident lies about property and money and a wealthy father in the old country. This is worth sitting with. The role of the person who says, "Look again," who does not accept the first interpretation, who insists on the possibility that what is being presented as the obvious explanation might be wrong, and whose insistence creates the opening through which truth can enter. These people, in this story and in many others, are essential. They are not always professionals. They are not always people with credentials or authority. They are sometimes, as in Bertha Sohn's case, simply people who loved someone and could not accept an explanation that did not fit what they had witnessed with their own eyes. But their willingness to say "look again" at cost to themselves, against the current of official interpretation and social pressure toward accepting the convenient explanation, is one of the most important things any person can do in the face of wrongdoing. Let us stay with Bertha for another moment. She lost her sister. She had to watch Marie deteriorate over weeks, knowing that something was wrong in a way she could not fully articulate, unable to stop it, unable to name it precisely enough to force the action that might have saved her. She had to sit with the grief of that, the particular grief of loss that had been preventable, that had been caused rather than simply happened, and the additional difficulty of knowing it and not yet being believed. When Marie died, Bertha had to make a choice. The easiest choice, the one that grief often drives people toward, was to fold into mourning, to accept the official explanation, to let the man who had been named as Marie's husband manage the aftermath with the authority that marriage conferred on him even in its most damaged form. This was the path of least resistance. It would have been understood by everyone around her. It would not have required her to do anything difficult or costly or uncertain of result. She did not take it. She chose the harder path. She spoke. She accused. She insisted. She kept insisting even when the initial response was probably not immediate action, when the police probably did not immediately drop everything they were doing to exhume a body on the basis of a grieving sister's accusation. She stayed with it until it was heard, and the hearing changed everything. If you are a woman listening to this story tonight, if you are one of the older women for whom this kind of story resonates in a way it might not for everyone, I want to say something directly to you. The Berthas of the world are everywhere. They may not be related to you by blood. They may be a friend, a neighbor, a colleague, someone who knows you well enough to notice when something is not right. And the women who survived Johann Hock, the women who had a Bertha, were not simply lucky in the random sense. They were lucky in the specific sense that someone in their life had decided that their life mattered enough to risk the cost of speaking up. That is a kind of love, an unglamorous, difficult, persistent, not giving up kind of love. The kind that does not get celebrated in the ways we usually celebrate love, in songs and stories and anniversaries. But that is, when you encounter it in the dark corners where it tends to operate, one of the most powerful things one person can offer another. And if you are listening to this story, in the dark, in your bed, drifting towards sleep, and there is someone in your life who has been that for you, or for whom you have been that, let that recognition settle warmly somewhere behind your sternum. It is worth carrying. It is worth knowing you have it, or have given it. The night is very deep now. The story is finding its way toward its end, not rushing, not pushing, just following the current as it moves. There is more still to tell, more reflection to do, more of the legacy to explore. But you have been here through so much of it already, and you deserve a moment simply to breathe. So breathe. In. Hold it gently, like a small and valuable thing. Out. Slowly. The weight of the day, and the weight of this story, and the weight of all the feeling it has asked you to carry, all of it releasing, a little more, with each breath. You are safe. The night is good. We continue. And so the questions. The unanswered questions that hover over this case like the light of a candle in a room where all the windows are closed. They do not go out. They do not resolve. They simply burn, quietly, in the part of this story that cannot be concluded because the information that would conclude it was carried away in the silence of a man who went to his execution without confessing. How many women did Johann Hock kill? This is the question that the Chicago investigators asked in the winter and spring of 1905, and it is the question that historians of American crime have continued to ask in the centuries since. The honest answer is that we do not know, and we will not know. And the not knowing is itself a kind of testimony about the nature of what he did and the conditions under which he was able to do it. What we can do is follow the thread of confirmed names as far as it goes. The investigators in Chicago, working through the testimony of former wives and associates, and through their own cross-referencing of records in multiple cities, established a list of women who were confirmed or strongly suspected to have been his victims in the murder sense rather than simply the fraud sense. 6 women is the number most frequently cited as a confirmed minimum, though the word confirmed here carries the asterisk of an era in which confirmation required the kind of forensic evidence that was not routinely sought, and the cases in this confirmed group were the ones where evidence happened to be available or where surviving witnesses happened to speak up. Marie Walker is at the top of this list. Her case is the most thoroughly documented, the most forensically clear, the one around which the prosecution was built and the conviction obtained. She is the woman whose death we know most about because her death was the one that finally broke the pattern open. But she was not, by any reasonable assessment, the first. Before her there is the name Anna Gork. She appears in the reconstructed timeline of Hock's activities as a woman who married him, or a man presenting himself as him, in circumstances that followed the familiar pattern. The specific details of her case are fragmentary, preserved in the kind of partial record that reflects how thoroughly the lives of immigrant women of her era could pass through the world without generating durable documentation. She was married. She became ill. She died. The illness was attributed to natural causes at the time. The natural cause attribution was almost certainly wrong. There is Mary Becker. There is Anna Hendrickson. These names appear in the investigative record that the Chicago police assembled during the weeks and months following Haack's arrest. Names gathered from the testimony of people who had known him under various aliases in various cities and who, when they heard the description of what he had done in Chicago, recognized the pattern from their own experience of him. The investigators were collecting these names not for purposes of additional prosecution, since Haack had already been convicted and sentenced on the Walker charge, but because they understood that the full accounting of his crimes was important in its own right. Important for the historical record. Important for the families of the named women. Important as a measure of the scope of what had been allowed to happen through a combination of his skill and the system's inadequacy. Caroline Stryker. She is mentioned in several accounts of the case as a woman who had a particularly tragic encounter with Haack. The specific details of what happened to her are not fully recoverable from the available historical record, but she appears in the list of suspected victims with enough regularity across different sources to suggest that she was, in the estimation of the investigators, one of the women whose death was not natural. And then there are the names from Germany. Before he came to America, before he reinvented himself as the man who would move through the immigrant communities of the Midwest with arsenic in his fountain pen, he had a life in Strasbourg. He had a family, a minister father, brothers who chose the path he abandoned. And he had, according to some accounts, relationships in Germany that followed patterns consistent with what he would do in America, marriages or near marriages that ended in ways that, had they been examined in the light of what was later known about him, might have raised questions. These German connections are almost impossible to investigate from a distance of more than a century. The records, whatever they may have been, are largely inaccessible. And the investigators who built the Chicago case were not in a position to pursue international inquiries in the detail that would have been necessary to establish anything definitive. So the German chapter remains open, a question mark at the beginning of a story that already has too many question marks. The number 50, the number the newspapers settled on as their estimate of his total marriages, is almost certainly an exaggeration. The newspapers of the era were not above inflating a number if the inflated version made a better headline. And 50 is a dramatically larger and more appalling number than 15 or 20, and it served the narrative of the monster that the papers had constructed around Haack. But 15 or 20, the more conservative estimates that serious investigators put forward, are still staggering numbers when you hold them alongside the awareness that each of those 15 or 20 was a real woman with a real life that was interrupted or destroyed by the same man running the same scheme. And the murder count, as distinct from the fraud and bigamy count, is probably somewhere between 6 and 20, with the lower end of that range being the number that can be supported by something approaching hard evidence, and the upper end being the number that professional investigators who were closest to the case believed was more accurate. This range, 6 to 20, represents a span of uncertainty that is itself a measure of the damage done by fragmented records and inadequate systems and the structural invisibility of the specific population he targeted. Now, there is one more character who deserves to appear in this telling before we move toward the final reflections. Not a victim, not a law enforcement figure, but someone who entered the story at its edge and who is a puzzle that this kind of case tends to generate. Her name was Cora Wilson, and she has been mentioned briefly but not yet fully considered. Cora Wilson was a woman of some means and apparently strong opinions who became involved in the Haack case after his conviction, specifically in the effort to fund his appeals. She was not, by the accounts available, a naive woman. She had access to the full newspaper coverage of his case and crimes. She understood, at a factual level, what he had been convicted of and what he had been accused of beyond the conviction. And she became involved in his defense anyway, writing to him, visiting him in jail, providing financial support for the legal work that might have overturned the conviction. The question of why she did this is one that the newspaper reporters of the time found endlessly fascinating and that they answered, with varying degrees of generosity, in their coverage. The less generous interpretation suggested that she was simply another victim, that she had fallen under his spell through the medium of his jailhouse communications in the same way that the women who married him had fallen under his spell through personal contact, that his specific gift for making people feel chosen and seen operated as effectively through correspondence as it did in person. The more generous interpretations suggested something more complicated, that she was genuinely persuaded, by some examination of the evidence or by some aspect of his communication with her, that the case against him was more uncertain than the verdict suggested, that she was exercising the fundamental human impulse to extend some measure of humanity and procedural fairness even to people who had done terrible things, that she understood the irreversibility of execution and wanted to be certain, with a certainty she apparently did not yet have, that the irreversible was being done to the right person. The generous interpretation is not entirely dismissible, though the evidence that Hawk was the right person was very strong and the appeals courts that reviewed the case found it adequate. But the impulse it represents, the impulse toward caution in the face of permanent punishment, is a serious and defensible one, and the fact that it was operating in Cora Wilson's case in connection with a man who had almost certainly murdered multiple women does not automatically make it irrational. What is striking about her appearance in this story, from a historical perspective, is that she is a very early example of something that becomes considerably more common in later decades, which is the figure of the woman who advocates for the convicted male criminal, who maintains a belief in his innocence or his humanity or his right to legal recourse in the face of the evidence and the verdict and the social consensus. This figure becomes almost archetypal in the era of high-profile true crime. The woman who corresponds with the man on death row, who campaigns for his appeal, who insists on complexity in a situation that most people have simplified into verdict and punishment. The psychology of this figure is a study in itself, and this is not the space for that study in full. But briefly, the impulse to see the full humanity of someone who has been categorized as beyond humanity is not itself wrong. The conviction that even a convicted murderer retains certain rights and deserves a certain minimum of procedural fairness is not wrong. What is complicated is when these entirely defensible impulses become the vehicle for a specific kind of re-victimization, when the advocacy for the murderer comes at the cost of erasing or minimizing the murdered. Cora Wilson does not appear to have dismissed or minimized what Hawk had done to Marie Walker. She did not, by the available accounts, argue that the women he had harmed were unimportant or that their suffering was overstated. She simply argued, or acted on the argument, that the legal case deserved another look. Whether this represents an admirable commitment to procedural fairness or something more personal and more complicated, we cannot say. She passes out of the historical record after the appeals are exhausted and the execution proceeds. What we are left with, in this most peculiar corner of the story, is another unanswered question. Another element of the human complexity that gathers around extreme cases. The ways that people who are not directly involved respond to them. The ways that the proximity of great darkness generates in some people a strange form of attraction, a need to be close to the thing that everyone else is backing away from. Not a praiseworthy response, perhaps, but a human one. And this story has always been, at its core, a human story in all its complicated and sometimes contradictory dimensions. Let us turn now to the legacy of the case in the specific context of criminal profiling, which in 1905 did not yet exist as a formal discipline, but which the Hawk case contributed to in significant ways. The effort to understand Johann Hawk, to develop a picture of what kind of person he was and why he did what he did and how he selected and approached his victims, was an early version of exactly the kind of analysis that would be formalized and systematized by the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit in the 1970s, and that has since become a standard tool of law enforcement investigation. The characteristics identified in Hawk's case, the targeting of a specific vulnerable demographic, the use of social and community trust networks as access points, the rapid escalation of intimacy, the financial manipulation as the primary explicit goal, the use of poison as an efficient method of removing women who had been financially exhausted and were therefore no longer useful as financial targets. These are the kinds of behavioral patterns that profilers learn to identify and use as investigative tools. The specificity of his victim selection, middle-aged widows without children, in immigrant communities, encountered through community institutions, is a profiling element. It tells you something about what he was looking for, which tells you something about where to look for him. The rapidity of his courtships, the pressure for quick marriage and quick financial transfer, is a behavioral marker. The use of multiple aliases in multiple cities is an operational characteristic that speaks to a specific kind of planning and risk management. Had the FBI's profiling methods existed in 1905, the Johann Hock case might have been closed years earlier. A behavioral analysis of the pattern of suspicious deaths in German immigrant communities across the Midwest, matched against reports of matrimonial fraud in the same communities over the same period, would have produced a composite portrait that would have identified the same person committing all of these crimes long before the specific arsenic evidence in the Walker case broke it open. But the methods did not exist. And so the learning happened after the fact, in the cases, in the professional literature, and the training programs that came later. The Hock case became one of the historical data points from which the profiling discipline drew its understanding of what serial predatory behavior looks like in the domestic context. The categories of behavior that were identified through the painstaking reconstruction of his activities contributed to the toolkit that would eventually make it harder for a person like him to operate across the span of years and cities that he managed to cover. This is the specific form of his legacy in the formal history of American law enforcement. Not a flattering legacy, obviously. Not the kind of legacy anyone would choose to leave. But a real one, in the way that all deeply studied cases leave legacies in the disciplines that study them. He is a data point. A particularly rich and specific data point, because the reconstruction of his case was thorough enough and the documentation of his methods precise enough to allow meaningful analysis. And we might say, in a spirit that is strange but not entirely inappropriate, that the women he targeted and killed contributed, in their deaths and through the investigation those deaths ultimately generated, to a body of knowledge that made other women safer. This is a cruel irony. They deserve to be safe themselves, without their deaths needing to serve any further purpose. But the knowledge that was built on the examination of what happened to them is real, and it has been used, and it has, in ways that are impossible to trace with precision, but that are nonetheless real, contributed to outcomes where predators like Hock were identified and stopped earlier. That is not justice. Let us be clear about that. It is not justice. It is not a redemption of the crimes. It is not a meaning that makes the deaths acceptable or the suffering warranted. It is simply the way that terrible things sometimes produce useful understanding, and the way that useful understanding can, over time, make the world marginally safer than it was before the terrible things happened. Marginally. Not completely. Not perfectly. But some. And some, in this context, is worth noting. If you are still listening, still here in the warm dark, thank you. I mean that in the plainest possible way. You have stayed with a story that required your patience and your emotional engagement and your willingness to sit with things that are difficult to sit with. And the fact that you have done that you have given these people, Marie and Bertha and the others, some portion of your attention and your care, is something. The night is very deep now. The kind of deep that makes the world outside feel far away and the world inside, the room around you and the breath in your chest, feel close and real and warm. Let yourself sink into that. Let the thinking and the feeling and the witnessing you have done tonight settle into the deeper parts of you. The parts that do not need to be examined or analyzed, but simply held. Rest. We are still here. The story has a little more. But the story will wait. There is a quality that long cases that extend over years and involve many victims and many investigations and eventually a trial and an execution, have in the memory of the communities they touch. They become stories. Not in the diminishing sense. Not in the sense that they are reduced to mere narrative and stripped of their weight, but in the sense that they enter the communal memory of a place and persist there, told and retold in different registers, in different contexts, carrying different emphases depending on who is telling them and to whom. Chicago remembered Johann Hock. The German immigrant communities of the Midwest remembered him, or remembered the fact of him. The fact that the trust they had built within their communities had been used against them, that the mechanisms of mutual aid and mutual recognition had been exploited by someone who understood them well enough to turn them into weapons. This memory was not comfortable. It was the kind of memory that produces a certain lasting wariness, a certain calibration of the degree to which surface markers of belonging should be trusted, a certain additional attention paid to the person who presents themselves as too perfectly suited to the community, too smoothly at home in all its registers. This wariness is not a bad thing in its moderate form. The appropriate calibration of trust, the recognition that belonging to the same community as someone else does not automatically make them trustworthy, is a practical wisdom. It is the wisdom that distinguishes healthy skepticism from paranoia. The recognition that most people encountered in most contexts are honest and well-intentioned, while maintaining enough alertness to recognize when something is not quite right. The Hawk case contributed to this calibration in the German immigrant communities of the early 20th century. Not through explicit lessons taught in schools or churches, though some of that probably happened, but through the more organic process of communal memory, through the stories told among people who had been close enough to the events to know them specifically, through the cautionary tales that got passed down in family circles about the danger of responding to matrimonial advertisements from strangers, about the importance of knowing someone's real background before handing over your savings, about the wisdom of listening to Bertha. Listening to Bertha, that particular lesson. The lesson that says when someone close to you has a strong intuition that something is wrong, when someone who loves you and has known you well and has no particular reason to be suspicious is nonetheless suspicious, that intuition deserves to be taken seriously rather than managed away. This is a lesson that Bertha Sohn's courage encoded into the communal memory of the case, and it is a lesson that retains its practical value at whatever remove from the original events. Now let us talk about something that the newspapers of the era discussed in the immediate aftermath of the Hawk case, and that occasional writers on women's history and crime history have returned to in the centuries since. And that is the specific question of what made the women of German immigrant communities in particular, and immigrant women in general, particularly vulnerable to the kind of scheme Hawk was running. We have touched on the economic dimension, the financial precariousness of widowhood, the limited options available to women who needed to establish a secure domestic life. We have touched on the social dimension, the trust networks within immigrant communities that Hawk exploited. But there is a third dimension that deserves attention, which is the dimension of social isolation from institutional protection. Many of the women who encountered Hawk were navigating American legal and institutional systems in a language that was not their first, through channels they did not fully understand, without the kind of access to professional advisors that might have provided some protective layer. They were, in the specific sense that matters here, outside the loops of the formal protective systems, not because they were undeserving of protection, but because those systems had not been designed with them specifically in mind, and because the barriers of language and culture and unfamiliarity made those systems less accessible. When you cannot easily consult a lawyer about a man's claims about his property, because you do not have ready access to a lawyer who speaks your language. When you cannot easily look up public records about a man's previous marriages because you do not know which office to go to or what documents to request or whether those documents would even exist in a centralized form. When you cannot easily compare notes with other women in other cities who might have encountered the same man because you have no mechanism for making contact with them. You are navigating with significantly less information than a more socially connected and institutionally embedded person would have. This specific form of vulnerability is not unique to immigrant women. It applies to many populations who exist at some distance from the formal protective systems of a society. People whose language or culture or economic position or social marginalization means that the safety nets that theoretically protect everyone actually protect them less efficiently, less reliably. The safety nets are full of holes, and the holes tend to be largest where certain populations are most likely to fall through. Johann Hawk's victims fell through holes. The arsenic in their bodies, where it was present, was not detected because no one asked for it to be sought. The pattern of his behavior was not flagged because no one was looking across jurisdictions. The false promises he made were not verified because no one had the tools or the motivation to verify them in advance of the harm they caused. These are the holes. And naming them, understanding them with the kind of specificity that this case allows, is part of what makes the case historically significant beyond the drama of the individual story. Now let us talk about what happened to the German immigrant communities of Chicago in the years following the Hawk case. Because life continued. The Abend Post continued to publish. The churches continued to hold services. The mutual aid societies continued to operate. The community did not dissolve under the weight of what Hawk had done within it. It absorbed the experience and continued forward, the way communities always do in the aftermath of the terrible things that happen within or to them. But there were changes. Small ones, largely unheralded. The kind that do not appear in formal records, but that are visible if you look at the texture of community life in the years following a significant breach of trust. The matrimonial advertisement columns became slightly more scrutinized. The community grapevine around suspicious men became slightly more active. The informal networks of women who shared information about people who were not what they seemed became slightly more deliberate and slightly more organized. These informal protective networks, the ones that operate through conversation and shared knowledge and the quiet passing of warnings between women who trust each other, have always been one of the primary mechanisms through which women have protected each other from predators who operated below the threshold of official notice. They are not perfect. They do not catch everyone. But they are real, and they have been real across centuries and cultures, and in communities where they operate well, they provide a layer of protection that formal systems often cannot. Bertha Sohn's act of speaking up was, in a sense, the formal expression of exactly this informal network. She was the conduit through which the accumulated unease and suspicion of people who had been watching Johann Hawk and not quite trusting what they saw was translated into official action. She was the person who took what the informal network had produced, the sense that something was wrong, and carried it into the formal system where it could become evidence and investigation and eventually justice. This translation, from informal network to formal system, is often the critical step in cases like this. And it requires exactly what Bertha Sohn had in abundance, which is the courage to say something out loud to people with institutional authority, to risk being disbelieved or dismissed or treated as a hysterical woman projecting grief onto an innocent man, and to keep saying it until someone listened. Now there is something that deserves to be said about the execution itself, about what that final chapter of the Johann Hawk story represents in the context of the case as a whole. The death penalty was, and is one of the most contested aspects of criminal justice, and this is not the space to resolve that contest, which is deeply philosophical and deeply practical, and has not been resolved in more than a century of sustained argument. But it is worth noting what the execution did and did not accomplish in this specific case. What it accomplished, it ensured that Johann Hawk would not find another Abend post-advertisement, would not find another widow without children, would not carry his fountain pen of arsenic into another boarding house in another city under another alias. It ended the specific threat he represented to the specific population he had targeted. In the most concrete and immediate sense, it protected future women from him. What it did not accomplish, it did not produce the accounting. It did not give investigators or families the list of names and cities and deaths that a full confession might have provided. It did not close the open questions that haunt this case. It did not restore anything to the women who had been damaged or killed. It did not, in the deepest sense, constitute justice for them. Because justice in its fullest meaning is not simply the punishment of the person who did the harm, but the full acknowledgement of the harm, the naming of it, the reckoning with it, and the commitment to preventing it from happening again. The punishment happened. The acknowledgement was partial. The naming was incomplete. The commitment to prevention was made by some in some institutions in some ways, and was not made by others, and did not produce transformations as fast or as thorough as the circumstances warranted. This is the condition that most serious cases of this kind leave behind. Not the clean closure of punishment successfully administered, but the messy and ongoing reality of partial justice, incomplete knowledge, and the continuing work of making things better even when better is a gradual and uncertain and always incomplete project. The women who were Hawk's victims deserved better than partial justice. They deserved the full accounting. They deserved the named truth of what had happened to them and why and who had done it, and how many others had been done the same way. They deserved, in some form, the acknowledgement that their lives had mattered and that their deaths had been a loss rather than a statistical inevitability. They did not get all of this. Some of them got some of it. Marie Walker got the exhumation and the arsenic evidence and the trial and the verdict and the execution of the man who killed her. She got more than many of the others. She got enough that her death was not simply absorbed into the undifferentiated record of women who died in the early 20th century of apparent kidney disease. But the others, the unnamed ones, the ones in the cities that were not investigated, the ones whose deaths remain attributed to natural causes and records that nobody has since had reason to re-examine. They did not even get that much. They got their deaths and the wrong names on their death certificates, and the man who killed them walking away unimpeded toward the next city, and the next alias, and the next widow without children who was about to respond to a newspaper advertisement. This is the part of the story that does not resolve, that cannot resolve, given the nature of the evidence and the passage of time. And it is important to sit with the non-resolution, to not paper over it with the partial satisfactions of the trial and the verdict and the execution, because the non-resolution is the truth of the case in its fullest form. The truth is that we do not know how many women he killed. We know he killed at least one in a way that can be forensically proven. We believe he killed more, based on the pattern and the evidence and the assessments of the investigators closest to the case. We believe the number is somewhere between 6 and 20 and possibly more. And we will never know with certainty because the evidence that would tell us does not exist or cannot be recovered. That is the truth. Imperfect and incomplete and resistant to the narrative satisfactions of definitive closure. But honest. Honesty is what we owe the people this story is about. Not the comfort of a clean ending. Not the false precision of a number that sounds authoritative but is really just a guess. Honesty about what is known and what is not known, and what the not knowing means for the way we understand what was done to these women. If you are still with me, still here in the late hours of this night with this story settled around you like the darkness itself, thank you for receiving that honesty, for staying with the uncomfortable parts rather than needing them to resolve into something easier to carry. The world is full of comfortable stories, stories that tie up neatly and leave you with the clean feeling of a resolved narrative. This is not one of those stories. And that is as it should be, because the reality it represents was not resolved cleanly, and pretending otherwise would be a kind of betrayal of the people it's about. But the night is still gentle, and the room around you is still safe. And your breathing, if you have been following it, is slow and steady and doing exactly what breathing is supposed to do, which is carry you forward, moment by moment, from one breath to the next, which is all any of us is ever actually doing. Let the next breath come, and the one after that. We are almost at the end now. Not quite, but close. And you have done the work to get here. The city of Chicago in the years immediately following the Hawk case was, in certain respects, different from the city it had been before. Not dramatically, not in ways that a visitor would immediately notice, not in ways that would have been visible in the architecture or the commerce or the daily surface of life in the city, but different in the specific ways that a community is always different after something significant has happened within it, after the event has passed through the communal consciousness and left its residue of changed understanding and adjusted expectation. The German immigrant community of Chicago was different. The women of that community, and in particular the widows who had been the specific target of Hawk's predation, were different. The informal networks of caution and shared information about potentially dangerous men were more explicitly activated than they had been before. The conversations between women at church and in the markets and in the parlors of friends were more attentive to certain kinds of detail. The specific combination of swift romance and financial pressure that had been Hawk's signature approach was now named, now identified, now part of the shared vocabulary of the community's self-protective awareness. This is how communities learn, through the terrible experience of what happens when the learning has not yet been done, through the grief and the damage and the outrage that follow, through the effort to make sure that what happened is remembered clearly enough and specifically enough to change behavior going forward. It is slow learning. It is costly learning. It is the kind of learning that we wish could happen in advance rather than in the aftermath. But it is real. And we might say something further about this, something about the particular wisdom that communities of women have always carried about the specific threats they face. Because the history of women's survival in patriarchal societies, which is most societies across most of recorded history, is in large part a history of informal collective intelligence, of the shared knowledge and shared warning systems that women have maintained in the absence of formal protection. The gossip, the whisper networks, the careful monitoring of men's behavior and reputation within communities, the quick and specific communication between women about who is dangerous and who is safe. All of these have been, for most of human history, the primary mechanism through which women have protected each other and protected themselves. This informal intelligence does not always work. It did not work for all of Hawk's victims, clearly, but it worked for some. The women who heard enough in time, who got the warning before they had given too much of themselves to the man who was the subject of the warning, owed their safety in part to the informal network. And the network itself was built and maintained by women like Bertha Sohn, women who had the particular combination of observation and courage and refusal to stay quiet that made them nodes of protection in the web of community. The formal systems that developed over the decades following the Hawk case, the improved forensic chemistry, the interstate communication protocols, the legal frameworks that made certain kinds of fraud easier to prosecute, all of these were and are important. They represent the institutionalization of certain kinds of protection that had previously been either absent or inadequate, but they did not replace the informal networks. They supplemented them. And the relationship between formal and informal protection remains, to this day, the actual structure through which most protection against the specific kind of intimate predation that Hawk represented is provided. Now let us consider something that has not been raised yet in this telling, which is the question of what happened to the children of the women Johann Hawk affected. Because some of these women were mothers, though his specific targeting of widows without children meant that the mothers in his direct victim pool were fewer than they might otherwise have been. He had been explicit about this preference. No children. Children complicated things. Children asked questions. Children had loyalties that were not transferable to a new stepfather, no matter how charming he might be. Children were, from his operational perspective, a liability. But some of the women he married or targeted had family members who functioned in analogous ways to children, who had connections to them and concerns about them, and the kind of protective investment that proximity and love create. And some of these people, like Bertha Sohn, were in positions where they could act on those concerns. The presence or absence of these protective figures in the lives of his targets was, in the reconstructed analysis of his case, one of the factors that determined how far along the process went before it was interrupted. The women who had a Bertha, a person who loved them and was watching and would not stay quiet, were more likely to survive. The women who were more isolated, who had fewer connections or whose connections were more distant or less attentive, were more vulnerable to the full execution of what he had planned. This is a painful truth, but it is also, in its own way, an actionable one. The reduction of isolation, the cultivation of close relationships with people who know you and love you and will notice when something is wrong, is a form of protection that no formal system can fully replicate. This is one of the reasons that this case, told to an audience of older women specifically, carries a particular resonance and a particular message. Because older women, as a demographic, are at various stages of the kind of life changes that can produce isolation, the death of a spouse, the departure of grown children, the retirement that removes the social structure of work, the gradual attenuation of social connections that can happen in later life if it is not actively resisted. And the isolation that can result from these changes is real, and it is significant, and it creates vulnerabilities of the specific kind that Johann Hawk spent his career exploiting. The message of this story, if it has one, is not do not trust, because a life lived in the refusal of trust is not a life that is being fully lived. The message is something more nuanced and more practically useful. It is, build your Berthas. Invest in the relationships that will see you, that will notice when something is wrong, that will have the knowledge of you and the love for you that produces the specific protective attention that Bertha brought to her sister's situation. Those relationships require investment. They require the same energy and care and vulnerability that any meaningful relationship requires. But they are, in the specific context of this story and the threats this story represents, also protection. The city of Chicago in 1906, in the weeks after the execution of Johann Hawk, went on with its ordinary business. The newspapers moved to other stories. The German immigrant community absorbed what had happened and adjusted its collective understanding and moved forward. The specific case closed with the finality that an execution produces whatever one thinks about executions as a matter of principle. But the questions, the open and unanswerable questions about the full extent of what he had done and the full number of women whose lives had been interrupted or ended by his choices, those questions did not close. They remained in the record, in the historical ledger of things that happened, and were not fully accounted for, where they remain to this day. Let us spend a moment now, before we move into the final reflections of this telling, with the question of what it means to be the kind of person who does what Johann Hawk did. Not the psychological mechanics of it, we have been through that in some detail, but the moral reality of it, the specific nature of the choices involved. Because Johann Hawk was not a man who acted without thought. He was not someone who had lost the capacity for rational deliberation, who acted on impulse without awareness of consequences. Everything he did was deliberate. The selection of the targets, the construction of the personas, the specific lies chosen for their specific persuasive utility, the timing of the arsenic, the decision to flee, the readiness to start again in the next city. All of it deliberate, all of it chosen. This means that at some point in his life, early on, before the pattern was fully established, there was a moment when he considered what he was doing and decided to continue. A moment when the question of whether to use other people this way, whether to exploit their trust and their need and their hope for your own gain, was answered in a specific direction. Not in the direction of conscience. Not in the direction of the recognition that the women he was planning to deceive and potentially murder were full human beings whose lives had the same value as his own. But in the other direction, in the direction of deciding that they were resources to be managed rather than people to be in relationship with. We cannot know when this decision was made. We cannot know whether it was made all at once or accumulated gradually through a series of smaller decisions, each one slightly less resistible than the last. But the decision was made. At every point along the way, from the first fraud to the last planned marriage, the decision was made again and again in the direction of treating other people as means rather than ends. This is, in the most fundamental philosophical sense, the core of what is wrong with what he did. Not just the murder, though the murder is obviously and definitively wrong. Not just the fraud, though the fraud is also wrong. But the foundational decision, the repeated choice, to treat other human beings as objects to be used rather than persons to be respected. To see in their need and their hope not a claim on his human responsibility, but an opportunity to be exploited. The great moral traditions of most cultures, the philosophical and religious frameworks that have tried across centuries to articulate what we owe each other, converge on this as the most basic violation. The violation of treating persons as things. The refusal to recognize the intrinsic value of other human lives. This is what Johann Hawk did, systematically and deliberately, and over many years, and it is what made what he did not just a series of crimes, but something that cuts against the most fundamental preconditions of human community. We live together on the assumption that other people are, at the core, trying to behave as the human beings they are. We extend trust. We make ourselves vulnerable. We enter into the intimate territories of love and need and hope, on the assumption that the person we are doing this with is real in the way we are real, that there is something behind their eyes that corresponds to what we experience behind our own. Johann Hawk violated this assumption with full knowledge and complete indifference to its cost. The cost was paid by the women he chose. The cost is still being paid, in the sense that the full accounting of that cost remains incomplete and the question of its full extent remains open. But the cost was known. It was knowable to anyone who looked clearly at what he was doing. And the systems that should have made it harder to exact that cost were inadequate. This is the honest ending of this part of the story, not the clean closure of justice fully served, because justice was only partially served. Not the reassurance that everything turned out all right, because everything did not turn out all right for the women who did not have a Bertha, who went into their graves with wrong names on their death certificates, and the man who killed them already on his way to the next city. But something better than nothing. Bertha, the exhumation, the arsenic evidence, the trial, the verdict, the execution. These things happened. They were real. They were, within their limits, the system working as it was capable of working, shaped by the limits of its era, but still producing something recognizable as justice in the most essential sense. The naming of a wrong, the holding of a person accountable, the affirmation that the lives of the women he had killed mattered enough to pursue, to prosecute, to punish. Let that stand, for a moment, in the company of the incompleteness. Let it not be displaced by the incompleteness, because the incompleteness is real, but let it also not be displaced by what was real and was done and did matter. Breathe. Slowly. You have carried a great deal of this story with you tonight. You have been a thoughtful and patient presence with it. Let the breathing carry some of it away now. Not all of it. The things worth remembering should stay. But the heaviness of it, the weight that accumulates when you stay close to difficult truths for a long time, let that lighten a little with each breath. You are still here. The night is still good. And we are almost at the end. If we pull back now from the specific events and the specific people of this case, if we allow the camera, so to speak, to draw wide and show us the larger picture within which the story of Johann Hawk is a single but significant feature, we begin to see something that connects this story from the early 20th century to the much longer history of a particular kind of human vulnerability and a particular kind of human predation. Throughout recorded history, in cultures and eras vastly different from the immigrant communities of early 20th century Chicago, there have been people who understood that the basic human need for connection and security, when it exists in a form of heightened urgency, when it is uncoupled from the ordinary social systems that normally allow people to evaluate the trustworthiness of potential partners, creates an access point for exploitation. This has been true in every era. The specific forms it takes change with the specific social and technological landscape of the time, but the underlying structure does not change. In the medieval period, the remarriage of widows with property was regulated through a combination of church law and community oversight, specifically because the vulnerability of those widows to financial exploitation by unscrupulous suitors was a recognized social problem. The regulation was imperfect and often served the interests of the regulating parties rather than the widows themselves, but it reflected the awareness that the specific combination of grief and need and social pressure that characterized widowhood created predictable vulnerabilities. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as urban growth began to dissolve the close community oversight that had provided some informal protection against this kind of exploitation, the rates of matrimonial fraud increased. The very mobility that made cities exciting and full of opportunity also made them difficult environments in which to verify the claims of strangers, difficult environments in which the informal information networks that served as protective systems in smaller, more stable communities simply did not operate with the same effectiveness. Johann Hawk was a product of this urban mobility and a master of its exploitation. But he was not a unique phenomenon. He was the most extreme and the most documented instance of a pattern of predatory behavior that was, in his era, far more common than the newspapers suggested. The newspapers found him fascinating precisely because his scale was unusual, because the number of his suspected victims was larger and the geographic reach of his operations wider than what normally made it into court. But the basic scheme, the matrimonial advertisement, the swift romance, the financial extraction, the abandonment, or the something worse, was known to investigators and social workers of the era as a persistent feature of urban life. Women's advocacy organizations of the early 20th century, the kinds of organizations that were building the infrastructure of the suffrage movement while also doing practical social work in immigrant and working-class communities, were aware of this problem. They wrote about it. They organized against it. They developed educational materials for immigrant women specifically, materials in multiple languages that tried to communicate the warning signs of matrimonial fraud and the steps that women could take to protect themselves. These efforts were hampered by funding and by the social attitudes of an era that was still deeply ambivalent about the proper scope of women's agency. But they were real. The Hawk case gave these organizations a concrete and high-profile example to point to in their advocacy work. Here, they could say, is what this looks like in its most extreme form. Here are the warning signs. Here is what happened when a woman trusted too quickly without verification. Here is what the consequences can be. The use of specific cases as teaching tools, as illustrations of abstract warnings, is a standard and effective pedagogical approach, and the Hawk case served this function for advocates who were trying to make women safer in a world that was not always disposed to prioritize that goal. Now let us turn to something that this story evokes, but has not yet been named directly. The fairy tale of Bluebeard, the French story from which Hawk's press nickname was derived, is one of the oldest and most persistent cautionary tales in the Western tradition. It was collected and published by Charles Perrault in 1697, though its roots extend considerably further back into oral tradition. The story, in its classic form, concerns a wealthy nobleman who has a history of dead wives and who, when he marries again, gives his new wife the keys to all the rooms in his castle except one, which she is forbidden to enter. She enters it, of course, and discovers the bodies of his previous wives. The standard reading of this story, the reading that has been most commonly repeated across the centuries since Perrault published it, is about curiosity and disobedience, the woman who could not resist the forbidden room and who must be rescued from the consequences of her own transgression. But this reading requires some of the most significant possible misreadings of what the story actually contains. A more careful reading makes something very different of the woman in the story. She is not destroyed by curiosity. She is saved by it. Her decision to enter the forbidden room is the decision that allows her to understand what she has actually married, and understanding it gives her the information she needs to survive. The transgression, the refusal to comply with the husband's prohibition, is the act that saves her life. Without it, she would have gone the way of all the wives before her, into that room as a victim rather than as a witness. The name Bluebeard was applied to Johann Hock not without reason, but the full resonance of the source story is worth understanding. Because the real lesson of Bluebeard, properly read, is not about the dangerous curiosity of women. It is about the danger of the man who maintains forbidden rooms, who insists on the right to prohibit inquiry, who relies on compliance and the suppression of doubt as the condition of his power. The man who says do not ask questions. The man who performs warmth and wealth and stability while maintaining a locked room that nobody is supposed to think about. Johann Hock was a man who maintained forbidden rooms. The rooms contained the truth of his aliases, his previous marriages, his extracted money, his arsenic. And the women who asked questions, who refused to simply accept the presentation, who took seriously the doubt that something might be in the locked room, were the ones who had a chance at survival. Bertha Sohn entered the forbidden room. She asked the question that the doctor and the household and the social norms of the moment were all suggesting she not ask. And what she found there was not a transgression. It was the truth. There is something in this that extends beyond the individual case into the broader question of how we understand feminine curiosity and doubt, and the refusal to accept the surface presentation of things at face value. These qualities, too often characterized as weakness or deficiency, as the inability to simply trust, are in the context of this story and many others like it exactly what survival requires. The woman who does not ask questions, who does not follow the doubt when it arises, who accepts the warmth and the promises and the presentation without subjecting them to the test of inquiry, is the woman who is most vulnerable to the specific kind of predation that Johann Hock represented. This is a hard truth for any culture that romanticizes unconditional trust in intimate relationships, that celebrates the opening of the self to another without reservation as the highest form of love. There is real and genuine beauty in that kind of trust when it is appropriately placed. But appropriately placed is the crucial qualifier. And the process of determining appropriate placement requires exactly the inquiry, the questions, the attention to inconsistency, the willingness to take seriously the doubt that arises when something does not add up, that is sometimes characterized as the failure to trust rather than as the reasonable exercise of discernment. These are not easy ideas to hold in balance. The balance between openness and vigilance, between the warmth that makes connection possible and the alertness that makes safety possible, is one of the most difficult calibrations that human beings navigate, and there is no formula that makes it simple. But the history of what happened to the women in Johann Hock's orbit suggests that erring in the direction of more questions rather than fewer, of more verification rather than less, of taking seriously the Bertha in your life who says something feels wrong, is the direction that serves survival, not the direction of no trust, not the direction of the closed and armored life that refuses all intimacy, because intimacy is risky, but the direction of earned trust, slow trust, trust that has time to be tested and examined before it is allowed to carry the full weight of your savings and your safety. Marie Walker moved too fast, but we must be careful, even in saying this, because the system that allowed her to move too fast was not a neutral system. It was a system that had not yet developed the tools to make slower, more verified courtship easy. A system in which the information that would have allowed her to verify Johann Hock's claims was not readily accessible. A system in which the cultural norms around courtship in immigrant communities of that era pushed toward relatively swift marriage as the practical, and socially expected resolution of courtship. She was working within that system with the tools it gave her. And the tools were not adequate to the threat. The tools are better now. Background checks are possible. Public records are more accessible. Interstate communication is instant rather than dependent on physical mail. The specific mechanisms that allowed Hawk to operate across multiple jurisdictions without being connected are largely obsolete in the digital era. His particular scheme would be much harder to execute today, though not impossible. And the digital era has created its own versions of the same underlying structure, its own matrimonial advertisement equivalents, its own ways of presenting a false self to a vulnerable audience in search of connection and security. The underlying structure does not change, only the technological form it takes, which is why the story of Johann Hawk, a century and more after the events it describes, retains its relevance. Not as historical curiosity, but as a lens through which to see something persistent about human vulnerability and human predation and the systems we build, or fail to build, to protect people from both. If you are still awake, if the night has stayed with you through all of this and you are still here in the gentle dark, I want you to know that you have spent your time on something real tonight. The people in this story were real. The things that happened to them were real. The systems that failed them were real. And the love that saved some of them, Bertha's love, was as real as anything in the story. Let that be the weight you carry into sleep, if you are ready now to let sleep come. Not the weight of the arsenic and the aliases and the cold calculation of a man who counted women as resources. That weight has been acknowledged and does not need to be carried by you. But the weight of Bertha's love, which was not heavy but was solid, which was not dramatic but was absolutely and unequivocally real, that is worth carrying. The night is very deep now, deeper than when we began. The world outside has quieted to whatever its quietest register is at this hour, and inside the room where you are there is warmth and the softness of your bed, and the slow and steady rhythm of your own breathing, which has been there all along, doing its faithful and uncelebrated work. Let your eyes close if they want to close. Let the thinking slow. The story has done what it set out to do, which is to carry you through the real and difficult and important things it had to say, slowly enough and carefully enough that you have had time to receive them without being overwhelmed by them. You have been a good and patient witness. Rest. We have a little more, but not much. And what remains is the softer part, the part that lands gently and asks nothing more of you except to receive it. There are places in Chicago today that carry no visible marker of what happened in them in the winter of 1904 and the spring of 1905. The neighborhood where Marie Walker had her candy store on Willow Street has changed many times over in the century and more since her death. The buildings are different. The people are different. The community is different. The specific texture of the German immigrant neighborhood that surrounded her life is gone, absorbed into the broader flow of the city's continuing evolution. But the street is still there. The street still exists. And if you were to walk down it on a winter evening, when the sky over Chicago sits low and gray the way it did in December of 1904, when the air has that specific quality of cold that comes in off the lake and settles into the low places of the city, you might feel, without knowing why exactly, some faint resonance of what happened there. Not a ghost story, not anything supernatural. Just the ordinary way that places carry the weight of their histories, even when those histories are invisible, even when the physical evidence of them has been entirely replaced by the new construction of later decades. Marie Walker lived there. She ran a candy store and knew her customers by name, and kept her shop clean, and had her sister nearby, and hoped, carefully, and with the particular modesty of a practical woman who knew the difference between what she needed and what she could realistically expect, for a life that was a little less alone. She deserved that life. It was not an extravagant hope. It was a modest and entirely reasonable one. She deserved someone real to come home to. She deserved evenings that felt inhabited rather than empty. She deserved a new chapter that was actually a new chapter rather than the final one. She got something else. And the something else ended on January 12th, 1905, in a room where her body was burning with what the doctor had misnamed, while the man who had misnamed it for her, in the most fundamental sense, sat somewhere in that same house with a composed face and a practical mind already turning toward what came next. But she also got Bertha, and Bertha got her justice. Not perfect justice, not the full accounting, but the naming, the recognition, The arsenic evidence and the trial and the verdict and the execution, the affirmation that her life had mattered enough to pursue. That is something. It is not enough, but it is something. When we tell stories like this one, when we sit with the history of terrible things that happened to real people and try to tell those things honestly and carefully and with the proper weight, we are doing something that has always been part of how human communities process the difficult realities of their shared history. The telling serves the memory. The memory serves the people who are remembered. And the people who are remembered, their lives and their deaths and the specific circumstances of both, serve the living by contributing to the collective understanding that makes those living somewhat safer, somewhat wiser, somewhat better equipped to recognize the warning signs when the warning signs appear. This is an imperfect process. It is slow and it is partial, and it is always at risk of being distorted by the framing of the teller. The story can be told in a way that makes it about the monster rather than the people he destroyed. The story can be told in a way that reduces the victims to their victimhood rather than honoring their full lives. The story can be told in a way that creates the comfortable illusion of comprehensive understanding and resolve questions when the questions are not resolved and the understanding is not comprehensive. We have tried, in this telling, to avoid those distortions, to keep the women at the center, to name and honor their full humanity rather than compressing them into the single dimension of their endings, to acknowledge the incompleteness of the historical record and the questions that remain open rather than papering them over with the false precision of definitive numbers and clean conclusions, to tell the truth about what the systems failed to do and what needs to remain changed even now. Whether we have succeeded in this is for you to judge. You have been here for all of it. You have heard the names: Marie Walker, Bertha Sohn, Mrs. Fisher, Barbara Brossart, Clara Bartle, Lena Hawk, Anna Gork, Mary Becker, Anna Hendrickson, Caroline Stryker, and all the others whose names we do not have. You have sat with their stories in whatever form those stories could be reconstructed from the fragments that survived. You have allowed them to matter to you, which is the most fundamental form of honor that the living can offer the dead. That is not nothing. In a world that moves quickly and forgets easily, and tends to prefer the drama of the perpetrator to the complexity of the victim, the act of sitting still and listening carefully to the full story, including the uncomfortable parts and the unresolved parts, is an act of genuine witness. And genuine witness is what these women deserved when they were alive and did not always receive, and what they deserve now in the telling of their stories. Let us talk for a moment about what we can learn going forward, not in a prescriptive or moralizing way. You are not a child who needs to be instructed. You are a grown person who has just spent considerable time with a complex and difficult story, and you have your own intelligence and your own life experience to bring to the question of what it means for you personally. But some things seem worth saying plainly. The speed of courtship is a warning sign, not an absolute prohibition on fast connections, because human chemistry is real, and sometimes things do move quickly in genuine and honest ways. But when the speed of a romantic connection is accompanied by financial pressure, by requests for money or assets before the relationship is fully established, before the person has demonstrated themselves through time and consistency to be what they claim to be, the combination deserves attention. It deserves the kind of slow and careful attention that can be difficult to bring to bear when you are in the middle of something that feels warm and hopeful and real. The absence of verifiable history is a warning sign. Johann Hawk relied on the difficulty of verifying his claims, on the fact that checking the story about the $8,000 and the cottage at Union Avenue and the wealthy father in Germany was practically difficult in 1905. The verification of such claims is considerably less difficult now. The tools exist. Using them is not an expression of distrust. It is an expression of the kind of reasonable care that protects the trust you want to extend from being misplaced. The Bertha in your life is a resource. When someone who knows you and loves you and has no particular reason to be suspicious is nonetheless suspicious, that is not nothing. It is not necessarily correct, because Berthas are also human and human intuitions are fallible. But it deserves to be heard and considered rather than dismissed as jealousy or overprotectiveness or the inability to let you be happy. The people who know you well enough to notice when something feels wrong are a form of protection. Let them be that. And the longer dimension of this, the cultivation of the relationships that produce Berthas in your life, The investment in closeness and honesty and mutual knowledge with people who care about your well-being is not just a nice thing to do. It is, in the specific context of this story and the threats this story represents, a survival strategy. The isolated person, the person who has allowed the connective tissue of close relationships to thin and fray, is more vulnerable to the specific kind of predation that Johann Hock practiced than the person who is deeply embedded in a network of people who know them and love them and will notice when something is wrong. This is not about living in fear. It is about living fully, in the sense of maintaining the full richness of human connection that makes a life feel inhabited and purposeful and held. The same connections that make life good also make life safer. They are not two separate things. Now let us have a final moment with the story of how this case has lived in history. Because the history of the Johann Hock case is not just the events of 1904 and 1905 and 1906. It is also the history of how the case has been told and retold, of how it has appeared in the literature of crime history, in the academic literature of forensic science and criminal psychology, in the popular literature of true crime that has flourished in various forms across the past century. The case appears in early 20th century compilations of notable American murder cases, where it was used as an example of the new forensic chemistry's capacity to solve crimes that would previously have gone unpunished. It appears in the professional literature of forensic toxicology as a case study in the detection of arsenic poisoning. It appears in the histories of Chicago crime that proliferated in the decades following the trial, in books that covered the city's most dramatic criminal moments with the affectionate gusto of a city that was never ashamed of its own history. It appears, somewhat unexpectedly, in feminist scholarship of the late 20th century, where it was examined as a case study in the structural vulnerabilities of immigrant women, in the specific intersection of gender and immigrant status and economic precariousness that created the conditions Hock exploited. This scholarship brought a dimension of analysis to the case that the original newspaper coverage had largely missed, the dimension that asks not just what the criminal did, but what systemic conditions made the doing possible. And it appears in the developing literature of predatory behavior and intimate partner violence that has grown substantially in the past few decades, as researchers and practitioners have worked to understand and document the patterns of behavior that characterize intimate predation, the better to recognize and interrupt those patterns before they reach their most extreme expressions. In each of these contexts, the case serves slightly different purposes and generates slightly different insights. But in all of them, the core of what the case is about remains the same. Women who were real and specific and worthy of protection were targeted and harmed, and in some cases killed by a man who understood their specific vulnerability and exploited it systematically and without conscience. And the systems that were supposed to protect them were not adequate to the threat. These things are true. They were true in 1905, and they are, in their updated forms, still true now. The specific vulnerabilities have changed. The specific mechanisms of predation have changed. The specific tools available to potential victims have improved considerably. But the underlying structure of intimate predation, the exploitation of trust and need and hope by someone who understands those things but does not share them, persists. Knowing it persists is not a reason to stop trusting or to stop hoping or to build walls against the possibility of connection. It is a reason to trust more carefully, to hope more discerningly, to build connections with people who can be, for you, what Bertha was for Marie, people who see you and love you and will not look away when something is wrong. That is the message that lives at the center of this story. Not the arsenic, not the aliases, not the cold calculations of a man who had reduced other human beings to financial resources. Those things are the horror of the story, and they deserve to be named and understood and remembered. But the center is Bertha. The center is the woman who would not look away, who could not look away, who spoke when speaking was difficult and costly and uncertain of result, who insisted that her sister's life and death mattered enough to be examined honestly. Bertha is the center. And in your life, the equivalent of Bertha is the most important thing you have. Keep it close. Invest in it. Know who your Bertha is. And when she says something is wrong, listen. Now let the night come fully for you. The story is almost done. The candles of this telling are burning low. The names have been spoken. The questions have been held. The weight has been acknowledged, and then, slowly, gently, released into the dark where it belongs. Marie Walker, Bertha Sohn, all the unnamed ones. You have been remembered tonight. You have been honored. The people who listened to this story sat with the truth of what happened to you, slowly and carefully, and with the intention of understanding it fully. That is what you deserved when you were alive. It is the smallest of amends, the most inadequate of acknowledgments. But it is real, and in the long darkness of history, real things matter. Rest now, all of you. The night is good. The world continues. And somewhere, in every community, in every network of people who love each other carefully, there is a Bertha, watching, ready to speak, refusing to look away. And so we arrive at the end. Not the end of the questions, which as we have established do not have endings. Not the end of the uncertainty about the full scope of what Johann Hawk did, which also does not resolve. But the end of this particular telling. This particular sitting together in the dark with a story that required your patience and your attention and your willingness to stay with difficult things rather than moving past them too quickly. You have been here for all of it. And that means something. Let us do what this kind of telling always does at the end, which is draw back slowly from the specific details and the specific people and the specific events, the way you draw back from a painting to see it whole rather than in its individual strokes. Let us look at the full picture for a moment before we set it down. Johann Hawk walked through the world for 45 years. For approximately the last 15 of those years, he walked through it as a predator with a system, moving between cities and aliases and communities, targeting women who had survived difficult things and were trying to build their lives forward from whatever loss had brought them to the place where they were. He found them through the specific mechanisms of trust that those communities had built for protection, through the German language papers, the community organizations, the matrimonial advertisement columns that were supposed to connect lonely people with honest intentions. He used those mechanisms as weapons against the people they were supposed to protect. He killed women. We do not know how many. We know at least one with forensic certainty and believe, based on the evidence and the pattern and the assessments of the people who investigated him most closely, that the number is considerably higher than one. The full accounting of his murders is not recoverable. It went with him to the grave, which was the final act of control in a life that was organized entirely around control. He was caught. He was tried. He was convicted. He was executed. These things happened and they represent, within their considerable limits, the working of a system that was inadequate to the threat he represented, but that, in the end, with the help of one courageous woman who would not be quiet, managed to produce something that looked like accountability. And the women he chose. The women who trusted him and were betrayed. The women who had their savings extracted and their dignity damaged, and in some cases their lives ended. They were real. They were specific. They were not defined by what happened to them, though what happened to them was terrible. They were defined by the full texture of their lives, by the candy stores they ran, and the sisters they loved, and the churches they attended, and the particular German accents they carried into an America that was not always as welcoming as they had hoped, and the specific ways they had learned to be resilient in the face of disappointment without losing the capacity to hope. They hoped. That is a thing worth saying simply and directly at the end. They hoped. And the hope was beautiful, and the hope was human, and the hope was absolutely right to exist, even if it led them into the path of someone who had learned to use hope as a door through which to walk and take what he wanted. The hope was not the problem. The hope was the point. The hope is always the point. Now, before we fully close this telling, let me do something that this kind of story sometimes calls for, which is to speak directly to the listener one more time, not about the historical events, but about you, specifically, whoever you are, wherever you are listening from. You chose to spend this time with this story. You could have watched something else, listened to something else, scrolled through something else in the hours before sleep. You chose to sit with this, to let it have your attention, to give your time, which is the most non-renewable resource any of us has, to the memory of people who lived more than a century ago in a city and a community and a world that in most external ways looks nothing like yours. That choice is not a small one. It reflects something about the kind of person you are, the kind of person who believes that other people's stories, even when those people are long gone and the direct consequences of their stories are long settled, still matter, still deserve witness, still carry lessons and weight and the fundamental human significance of real lives that were real while they were lived and that remain real in the ways that things become and stay real when they are told and received and remembered. That belief is not universal. Many people do not hold it. Many people move through the world with the past firmly in the past, consulted only when directly relevant to present practical concerns, otherwise allowed to recede into the irrelevance that distance produces. There is nothing wrong with this way of moving through the world. It is efficient, and it allows a certain lightness of forward motion that has its own value. But the people who hold the other belief, who carry the understanding that the past is not inert, that the stories of people who came before us have something to teach and something to offer and something to ask of us, those people perform a function that matters. They are the ones who keep the names alive, who make sure that Marie Walker is not just an entry in a newspaper archive, but a woman remembered in the living imagination of someone who cared enough to stay until the end of her story. You are that person tonight, and I want you to know that is a genuine and generous thing to be. The night is very late now, or very early, depending on how you count these hours. The world outside your window is doing whatever it does at this hour, the quiet turn of the planet continuing its long and different work regardless of what we think about it or what stories we have been telling. And inside your room, your body has been making its way, all this time, toward the rest it needs. Your muscles have been softening into wherever you are resting. Your breathing has been slowing. The day has been releasing its grip on you, hour by hour, as the night has deepened around this story. Let the rest come fully now. You have done the work. You have been the witness. You have held the names and the questions and the incompleteness and the partial justice and the Bertha and the hope with the care and patience they deserved. And now your body is asking you to let it go, to let the mind quiet and the conscious tracking of everything release and give way to the different kind of knowing that happens when we sleep. Let it go, slowly, the way everything eventually lets go in the dark, the way the last tension in the shoulders releases when the day is finally, truly over, the way the jaw unclenches, the way the hands open. You are held by whatever is holding you tonight, the mattress beneath you, the blanket above you, the walls of the room around you, the quiet dark that is doing what quiet dark always does, which is wait without judgment for you to be ready to rest. You are ready. Before I let you go fully, let me say one last thing. If this story has stirred something in you, if it has landed somewhere that feels important and you want to carry some part of it forward, the most meaningful thing you can carry is the name Bertha Sohn. Not as a historical fact about an immigrant woman in early 20th century Chicago, but as a principle. As a reminder that the most powerful thing any of us can do for the people we love is to pay attention and speak up when something is wrong. To be the person who says look again when the people around you are inclined to accept the comfortable explanation. To be the person who will not stay quiet even when staying quiet would be easier. Be a Bertha for the people you love. And let the Berthas in your life be Berthas for you. This is the lesson that this story carries. Wrapped in the specific historical details of arsenic and aliases and immigrant communities in early 20th century Chicago, but fundamentally a lesson about love and attention and the refusal to look away. A lesson about what we owe each other, about how we keep each other safe when the formal systems cannot fully manage it, about the specific and irreplaceable value of the person who knows you well enough and loves you enough to notice when something is wrong and say so. Now, the last of this telling, the very last. To Marie Walker, you were real. You built something. You hoped. You deserved the life you were trying to build. You are remembered. To Bertha Sohn, you did not look away. You spoke when it would have been easier not to. You changed the ending of a story that could have ended very differently. You are remembered. To all the women whose names we do not have, you were real too. You existed in the full complexity of your lives, with your particular histories and your particular hopes and the specific light that was yours and no one else's. You are held in the uncertainty of a history that could not count you completely. But you are not nothing. You are the space where the names should be, and that space is real, and it is kept. The night holds all of it now. Everything we have said, and everything we have left open, and every name we have spoken, and every question we have held. The night holds it with the same patience it holds everything, which is without judgment, and without hurry, and without the requirement that any of it be resolved before it is set down. You can set it down now. Breathe in, softly, the last breath of this telling entering you with everything it carries. Hold it for just a moment, a brief and gentle moment, and then let it go. Out into the dark where it belongs, where the story belongs, where the names go when the telling is done. You did something good tonight. Something quiet and unglamorous and easy to undervalue. You listened. You stayed. You let real people who are no longer here have the space of your attention for a little while, which is the most fundamental form of honoring there is. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of this story, which means you have heard all the names, which means none of them were spoken into a room where no one was listening. That matters. If you are still awake right now, if your eyes are still open and your mind is still turning, I want you to do something for me. Leave a comment. It can be anything. Tell me where you are and what time it is. Tell me what part of this story stayed with you. Tell me the name of your Bertha, if you have one, or if you want to be one. The comments section is the place where the people who stayed until the end find each other. And there is something warm and specific about knowing that someone else was here, at this same hour, with this same story, in their own version of the dark. And if you are not yet subscribed to this channel, and if this kind of storytelling is something that feels worth coming back to, I would be grateful if you would subscribe. This channel is built for the people who want to sit with real stories in the gentle dark, told slowly and with care, the way stories used to be told around fires before the world got so fast and so bright. Every subscriber is another person who believes in that kind of telling, and the community of people who believe in it is something worth building. Like the video if it served you tonight. That simple gesture helps more people find their way here, to this slow and careful place, when they are looking for exactly this. And to whoever is listening in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Australia and Canada, and every other place where people are tucking in and turning out the lights and letting the night come, good night. Truly and warmly, good night. To the women whose story we have been telling. Marie, Bertha, all the others, good night. You are remembered. You are honored. You can rest. And to you? Yes, you. The one who stayed all the way to the end. Who carried this story with patience and kindness and the willingness to sit with what was difficult. To you, good night. The most genuine and the most heartfelt good night I have to give. Let the night be good to you. Let sleep come soft and warm. Let the breathing slow to whatever its slowest and most restful rhythm is. And let that rhythm carry you forward into the hours before morning, which is what it was made to do. You are safe. The door is locked. The world outside is continuing its ordinary turning. And in this room, in this quiet, in this particular and temporary privacy of the night, you are entirely, completely, wonderfully at rest. Good night, my friends. Good night.